Imagine you're sitting in a room far away from Africa. In front of you are maps, rulers, and contracts. You don't know the people whose homeland you're talking about. You don't know their languages, their kingdoms, their trade routes, their history. And yet you decide where borders should run, who gets which territory, and who should own an entire continent in the future. This is exactly what happened in the age of colonization of Africa. In the 19th century, Europe did not look to Africa as an equal continent, but as booty. Raw materials, land, power, and prestige became more important than human lives, cultures, and established societies. Trading bases became colonies. Mission and research became tools of control. Political interests turned into wars of conquest, forced labor, and exploitation. But Africa was never just a victim. Everywhere there was resistance, clever diplomacy, uprisings, adaptation, the will to survive, and the struggle for dignity. Before we dive deeper into this story, feel free to write me in the comments. Do you think that the current problems of many African states are still related to the colonial era, or is this influence overestimated today? If you are interested in historical topics and want to understand how power, violence, and politics shape our world to this day, feel free to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, so you won't miss any more videos about the big turning points in history. In this video, we look at how the colonization of Africa began, why European powers divided the continent among themselves, what consequences this had for millions of people, and why the shadow of this era extends to the present day. 1. Africa before the European conquest. Before European powers began to almost completely divide Africa among themselves in the 19th century, the continent was by no means an empty space without history, order, or culture. This image only emerged later through colonial propaganda that portrayed Africa as backward, chaotic, and in need of help in order to morally justify conquest and foreign rule. In reality, before European colonization, Africa was a continent of enormous diversity. There were large kingdoms, extensive trade networks, powerful cities, religious centers, peasant communities, nomadic peoples, coastal cultures, and highly developed forms of political organization. If you want to understand Africa before the colonial era, you have to break away from the idea that there were only small, isolated groups there. Africa was connected, dynamic, and historically grown. Long before the arrival of European colonial powers, there were powerful empires in Africa whose influence extended far beyond their immediate borders. In West Africa, the Kingdom of Ghana emerged, later Mali and Songhai, which became important powers through trade, military strength, and political organization. Mali in particular became a center of wealth and learning in the 13th and 14th centuries. The famous ruler Mansa Musa, who ruled in the 14th century, is still considered one of the richest rulers in history. His empire controlled important trade routes through the Sahara and profited from the exchange of gold, salt, fabrics, slaves, horses, and other goods. Cities such as Timbuktu and Jen became centers of Islamic education, where scholars from different regions came together. Their religious texts were studied, law was taught, astronomy was practiced, and manuscripts were collected. These cities were not peripheral areas of world history, but part of a large intellectual and economic space. There have also been significant cultural and economic developments in East Africa. On the Swahili coast, which stretched along present-day Kenya, Tanzania, and Mozambique, wealthy city-states such as Kilwa, Mombasa, Malindi, and Zanzibar emerged. These cities were closely linked to trade in the Indian Ocean. Arab, Persian, Indian, and African traders exchanged gold, ivory, spices, fabrics, and ceramics there. Swahili culture arose from this combination of African, Arabic, and Islamic influences, but at the same time remained deeply rooted in the East African coastal world. The people there built stone mosques, had trade relations across wide seas, and developed their own language, Kiswahili, which is still one of the most important lingua franca in Africa today. This also shows that Africa was by no means isolated. Parts of the continent have been in contact with Arabia, India, and Asia for centuries. In Northeast Africa, Ethiopia had a particularly long state tradition. The Ethiopian highlands have been an area of independent political and religious development since antiquity. The Aksum Empire, which was already an important power in antiquity, had trade relations with the Mediterranean region, Arabia, and India. Later, Ethiopia developed into a Christian kingdom that maintained remarkable continuity despite internal conflicts, external threats, and changing dynasties. This long history of state autonomy later played an important role when Ethiopia resisted Italian colonialism in the 19th century and won a historic victory at the Battle of Adwa in 1896. But long before this event, Ethiopia was an example of how Africa had complex states, religious traditions, and political identities that were not created by Europe. In southern Africa, there are also multi-layered societies and centers of power. The Empire of Great Zimbabwe, which flourished between the 11th and 15th centuries, left behind impressive stone buildings that are still evidence of a highly organized society. Great Zimbabwe controlled trade routes and was connected to the coastal regions of the Indian Ocean. Gold and other goods were transported from there and integrated into international trade networks. The city's massive stone walls show that a political and economic elite existed here that could organize work, control resources, and visibly display power. Here, too, history refutes the colonial prejudice that Africa did not produce its own advanced civilizations. But Africa did not only consist of great empires. Many societies were organized decentrally, without a king or central state in the European sense. But that doesn't mean that they were disorderly. Often councils of elders, family associations, age groups, religious authorities, or local assemblies regulated coexistence. Decisions were made collectively, conflicts were resolved through mediation, and rights to land, livestock, or water were regulated by traditions. In some regions, power was strongly distributed. In others, it was concentrated with kings, princes, or warrior elites. This diversity made Africa particularly politically complex. European observers often did not understand such structures or did not want to understand them, because they only recognized political order where it resembled European ideas of the state, written administration, and monarchy. Africa was also economically complex before the colonial era. Agriculture played a central role in many regions. Millet, sorghum, rice, yams, bananas, beans, and other crops were grown according to the climate and soil. In savanna regions, livestock farming was particularly important, while in forest areas, other forms of agriculture dominated. Nomadic groups adapted to arid landscapes and moved with their herds over wide spaces. Merchants connected inland, coasts, desert routes, and river systems. The Sahara was not an impenetrable barrier, but a space of exchange. Caravans transported goods, news, religious ideas, and political influences between North Africa and West Africa. Rivers such as the Niger, Nile, Congo, and Zambezi served as lifelines for trade, agriculture, and settlements. Religion and interpretation of the world were also diverse. In North Africa and parts of West Africa, Islam had been spreading for centuries, often associated with trade, scholarship, and domination. In Ethiopia and parts of Northeast Africa, Christianity shaped old religious traditions. In addition, there were numerous African belief systems that were closely linked to ancestor worship, natural forces, healing, community, and moral order. These religions were not simply primitive ideas, but complex systems that explained how people were connected to their environment, their ancestors, and their community. They regulated rituals, law, power, and social responsibility. European missionaries later often despised these beliefs because they viewed them through the lens of their own religious beliefs. Of course, before colonization, Africa was not an ideal continent without conflicts. There were wars, power struggles, slavery, social inequality, and political violence. The rich rose and fell. Rulers fought for trade routes, livestock, land, and influence. Some societies profited from the slave trade and actively participated in it, while others were destroyed by it. The Atlantic slave trade in particular profoundly changed many regions long before direct colonial rule began. European demand for enslaved people intensified wars, shifted power relations, and led to massive violence. Nevertheless, it is important to recognize that these conflicts did not mean that Africa was destined for foreign domination. No continent in the world was free of war and inequality. Europe, too, has been marked by violence, religious conflicts, poverty, and power struggles for centuries. When European powers later began to colonize Africa, they did not encounter emptiness, but societies with their own history. They met states, traders, scholars, farmers, warriors, priests, craftsmen, fishermen, shepherds, and political leaders. They met people who defended their interests, formed alliances, resisted, or tried to negotiate with the new powers. The colonization of Africa was therefore not the beginning of African history, but a violent intervention in long-standing developments. This is precisely why it is so important to look at Africa before the European conquest. He shows that the later colonial rule must not be understood as a natural order. Europe did not simply bring Africa history, statehood, or culture. Rather, it destroyed, changed, and controlled many already existing structures. Anyone who wants to understand the colonization of Africa must first understand what existed before. Only then will it become apparent how deep the rupture caused by European imperialism was. Before the conquest, Africa was not a continent without history. It was a continent full of centers of power, trade routes, ideas, conflicts, cultures, and people who had long since shaped their own world. 2. First contacts and early trade relations. The European colonization of Africa did not suddenly begin with a division of the continent in the 19th century. It had a long history that stretched back many centuries. Before European states subjugated Africa with armies, treaties, and colonial administrations, they first approached the continent through coastal trade, seafaring, bases, and economic interests. These early contacts were not a complete conquest of the interior of Africa from the beginning. Rather, they arose on the coasts, in ports, on islands, and at trading centers. But it was precisely these first relationships that laid the foundation for later claims to power. Encounters became dependencies. Trade became control. Individual fortresses became colonial outposts. And out of economic curiosity, a system of European influence developed over time, which increasingly integrated Africa into the interests of the Atlantic world. Even before the arrival of the Europeans, Africa was integrated into large trading areas. North Africa has been in close contact with the Mediterranean since ancient times. Merchants from Egypt, Carthage, Rome, Arabia, and later from Islamic empires moved goods, ideas, and religious ideas over long distances. Caravan routes ran across the Sahara, transporting gold, salt, leather, fabrics, horses, and also enslaved people. In the east, trade in the Indian Ocean connected the African coast with Arabia, Persia, India, and Southeast Asia. The Swahili cities were prosperous centers of this exchange long before European expansion. Africa was therefore by no means isolated. When European seafarers appeared on the coasts in the 15th century, they entered existing trading worlds that they initially understood only partially and in which they were by no means immediately superior. Portugal played a decisive role. In the 15th century, Portuguese sailors began to systematically explore the West African coast. They were driven by several motives. They sought new trade routes to Asia, wanted to bypass the intermediary trade of Muslim traders, hoped for gold and other valuable goods, and at the same time saw themselves as representatives of a Christian claim to power. Under Henry the Navigator, Portugal promoted expeditions along the African coast. Step by step, Portuguese ships felt their way further south. They reached the coasts of Senegal, Guinea, and finally the Gulf of Guinea. This led to the first trade contacts with African rulers and coastal companies. The Portuguese were dependent on cooperation, because they did not know the political situation, were numerically weak, and could hardly hold their own in the long term without local partners. Trading in gold became particularly important. West Africa has been known for centuries for its gold deposits. European states coveted this gold because it could finance power, coinage, trade and military enterprises. Portugal built the fortress of São Jorge de Mina, known as El Mina, on the Gold Coast, in present-day Ghana. This fortress became an important symbol of the early European presence in Africa. It was a trading center, military base, and demonstration of power at the same time. But here, too, a European presence did not immediately mean complete domination over the hinterland. The Portuguese had to negotiate with African elites, pay taxes, form alliances, and integrate into local trade structures. African rulers were not passive spectators. They decided with whom they traded, what goods they demanded, and how they incorporated European traders into their own power interests. In addition to gold, ivory, pepper, skins, and other goods were soon also traded. European traders brought metal goods, fabrics, glass beads, weapons, alcohol, and other products to the coasts. These goods had different significance in African societies. Some served prestige, others were put to practical use, and still others changed local power relations. Weapons in particular could exacerbate conflicts because they gave certain groups military advantages. Nevertheless, these early trade relations should not be misunderstood as unilateral European dominance. Many African societies acted from a position of their own strength. They controlled access to the interior, knew the trade routes, and often determined the conditions of exchange. The Europeans were initially coastal actors, not masters of the continent. In the late 15th century, Portugal also reached Central Africa and came into contact with the Kingdom of Congo. This empire was politically organized, had a ruling structure with a king at the top, and had regional centers of power. The contact between Portugal and Congo was initially understood by both sides as a diplomatic and economic relationship. Congolese rulers were interested in European goods, Christian missionaries, written culture, and new forms of political representation. Some members of the elite embraced Christianity, and links were established between the court of the Congo and Portugal. But over time, it became clear how dangerous such relationships could become. The Portuguese demand for enslaved people grew, and with it the pressure on the internal structures of the kingdom increased. What had begun as trade and diplomacy was increasingly overshadowed by exploitation, kidnapping, and political destabilization. The Atlantic slave trade eventually became the central factor in Europe's presence on many African coasts. Although there had been forms of slavery in Africa before, European demand radically changed the scope, direction, and violence of the system. With the conquest of America, European colonial powers needed workers for plantations, mines, and colonial economic areas. Millions of Africans were abducted, sold, and transported across the Atlantic. European traders built forts, trading stations, and networks to organize this human trafficking. African middlemen, rulers, and war leaders were partly involved, but the enormous demand came from the Atlantic plantation economy. This fueled wars, tore societies apart, and unsettled entire regions. The early trade relations thus turned into one of the greatest human catastrophes in world history. From the 17th century onwards, other European powers besides Portugal became more active in Africa. The Dutch, British, French, Danes, Swedes, and later other states established trading bases on various stretches of the coast. Especially on the West African coast, numerous forts were built, which were often only a few kilometers apart. These fortresses served not only to protect goods, but also to promote competition between European powers. Every power wanted to secure access to gold, ivory, and enslaved people. The coast became an area of intense competition, where European traders competed with each other and at the same time remained dependent on local African partners. The European states fought for trade rights, but for a long time their power hardly reached deep into the country's interior. Another important area was southern Africa. The Dutch East India Company founded a supply station for ships on their way to Asia at the Cape of Good Hope in 1652. Over time, this station developed into a settlement colony. Unlike on many West African coasts, where European traders initially traded above all, European farmers settled permanently in the Cape. This development had profound consequences for the Khoi Khoi and San living there. Land was claimed, livestock was stolen, diseases spread, and local societies came under increasing pressure. The Cape became an early example of how a trading post could develop into a colonial settlement society in which European land grabbing, racism, and violence were on the rise. Despite all these developments, Europe remained mostly limited to coastal regions until well into the 19th century. Diseases such as malaria, difficult climatic conditions, a lack of geographical knowledge, and the resistance of African societies have long prevented comprehensive European control of the country's interior. For this reason, the early phase of relations was mainly characterized by trade, diplomacy, missions, coastal forts, and isolated violence. Europe was able to exert influence, but it was not yet able to fully dominate Africa. This limitation is important because it shows that later colonization was by no means inevitable. It was only made possible by new technical, medical, military, and political developments. The early contacts between Europe and Africa were therefore contradictory. There were exchanges, negotiations, mutual interests, and cultural encounters. At the same time, violence, exploitation, human trafficking, and growing dependencies arose. European traders came not only as merchants, but increasingly as representatives of expanding powers. African societies not only traded with Europe, but also had to assert themselves against its growing demands. In this phase, the entire continent was not yet colonially subjugated, but the foundations were laid. The coastal forts, trade routes, diplomatic contacts, mission stations, and economic interests later formed a network that European powers could fall back on when they wanted to conquer Africa with renewed determination in the 19th century. At the end of this early epoch, there is therefore a bitter realization. The colonization of Africa did not begin with soldiers, border demarcations, and colonial administrations. It began with glances at maps, with lists of goods, with trade treaties, with fortresses on the coast, and with Europe's growing belief that Africa was available. Initial trade developed into a power relationship that shifted further and further. What initially appeared to be an exchange became a threat to many African societies' freedom, security, and future. The early trade relations were thus not only prehistory, but already a decisive part of the development that later led to direct colonial conquest. 3. Slave trade and its consequences. The Atlantic slave trade is one of the darkest chapters in world history, and at the same time a key to understanding the later colonization of Africa. Long before European powers subjugated the continent with flags, armies, and administrative borders in the 19th century, human trafficking had already inflicted deep wounds. It destroyed families, changed power relations, weakened entire regions, and forcibly integrated Africa into a global economic system based on exploitation. Anyone who wants to understand the colonization of Africa must not regard the slave trade as a mere prehistory. It was a tremendous convulsion that changed the continent politically, economically, and socially, and later paved the way for many European powers to gain greater influence. Slavery existed in various forms even before the appearance of European traders. In many parts of Africa, there were dependencies, prisoners of war, debt slavery, or the integration of enslaved people into households and systems of rule. People have also been abducted and sold across the Sahara and the Indian Ocean for centuries. But the Atlantic slave trade took on a new dimension. With the European conquest of America, a huge demand for workers arose. Plantations in the Caribbean, Brazil, and later in North America demanded people who had to grow sugarcane, tobacco, cotton, coffee, and other products under the most brutal conditions. European colonial economies needed cheap labor, and because the indigenous population of America had been dramatically decimated by violence, disease, and forced labor, Europe's focus was increasingly on Africa. This demand gave rise to a trade triangle that connected Africa, Europe, and America. European ships brought goods such as weapons, fabrics, metal products, alcohol, and glass beads to the African coasts. There these goods were exchanged for captured people. This was followed by the so-called Middle Passage across the Atlantic, a journey full of narrowness, hunger, disease, violence, and fear of death. Those who survived this crossing were sold in America and forced to plantations or mines. The products produced there eventually returned to Europe and enriched traders, shipowners, plantation owners, banks, and states. It was a system in which people were turned into commodities, and in which economic gain was based on systematic dehumanization. The consequences for Africa were devastating. Millions of people were deported from their home regions between the 16th and 19th centuries. West Africa, Central Africa, and parts of Southeast Africa were particularly affected. It was not only about the number of abductees, but also about the social damage caused by this kidnapping. Many of the abductees were young men and women of working age. Their loss weakened agriculture, crafts, family structures, and local defense power. Villages were attacked, people fled unsafe regions, trade routes shifted, and mistrust between neighboring societies grew. In some areas, everyday life was determined by the constant danger of being captured and sold. The slave trade also changed the political landscape of Africa. Empires and rulers who had access to European trading posts or were militarily strong enough to raid other groups could gain considerable power. Weapons from Europe played an important role in this. They exacerbated existing conflicts and often made wars more destructive. Some states and elites participated in human trafficking because they derived wealth, weapons, and political advantages from it. Other societies became victims of this development and got caught up in a cycle of defense, flight, and counterviolence. Thus, new centers of power emerged, while others disintegrated. The European demand for enslaved people acted as an accelerant in political conflicts, which were increasingly oriented towards human abduction and sale. It is important to clearly state the responsibility without simplifying the story. European powers were the driving force behind the Atlantic slave trade because their colonial economies in America were based on enslaved labor. Without the plantations, without the European capital requirements, without the demand for sugar, cotton, tobacco, and coffee, this system would never have reached this enormous size. At the same time, African actors were not just passive victims. Some rulers, traders, and war leaders actively participated in trade and profited from it. But their participation arose within a market created and fueled by Europe, which rewarded violence and put pressure on more peaceful forms of economy. It is precisely this interdependence that makes the topic so historically complex and morally so difficult. For the European states, the slave trade became a source of enormous wealth. Ports such as Liverpool, Bristol, Nantes, Bordeaux, Lisbon, and Amsterdam benefited directly or indirectly from this business. Ships had to be built, insured, and equipped. Goods were produced and traded. Plantation products were processed, sold, and taxed. Banks and investors financed ventures based on the abduction and exploitation of people. The wealth that arose in Europe was therefore not only the result of technical progress and industriousness, but also of colonial violence and human trafficking. This connection is crucial when one later considers Europe's economic superiority in the age of imperialism. The slave trade also influenced European thinking about Africa. In order to justify the abduction of millions of people, European traders, scholars, clergymen, and politicians developed racist ideas that portrayed Africans as inferior. This ideology not only served to soothe the conscience, but also became a tool of domination. People who were considered less valuable could be more easily exploited, sold, and later colonially ruled. The racism that arose in connection with slavery and plantation farming did not disappear with the end of the slave trade. It lived on in new forms in the 19th century and became a central justification of European colonial policy. In Africa itself, too, the slave trade left deep social scars. Families were torn apart, communities of origin destroyed, and cultures of remembrance shaped. In some regions, tensions that continue to have an impact today between groups that have historically been involved in human trafficking as traders, intermediaries, victims, or aggressors. At the same time, communities developed strategies for survival. Villages moved to areas that were difficult to access. People built fortified settlements, formed protective alliances, or sought new trade routes. Resistance to slave hunting and kidnapping was widespread, even if it was hardly mentioned in many European accounts for a long time. The history of the slave trade is therefore not only a story of suffering, but also a story of flight, defense, memory, and human dignity. In the 18th and 19th centuries, criticism of the slave trade finally grew in Europe and America. Religious groups, former slaves, enlighteners, workers' movements, and humanitarian activists denounced the system. Particularly important were the voices of formerly enslaved people, who reported from their own experience of violence, abduction, and deprivation of rights. At the same time, the abolition of the slave trade should not be romanticized. Many European states ended trade not only for moral reasons, but also because economic interests changed. The Industrial Revolution made other forms of exploitation more attractive. Instead of abducting people en masse across the Atlantic, the focus was now more on control over raw materials, land, markets, and labor in Africa itself. This is the direct connection to later colonization. When the Atlantic slave trade was gradually banned in the 19th century, the European exploitation of Africa did not end. It only changed its shape. European powers now often declared that they had to civilize Africa, fight the slave trade, and establish order. But this moral language often concealed new economic interests. Missionaries, traders, military, and colonial officials took the place of the old slave traders. Palm oil, rubber, gold, diamonds, cotton, and copper became more important than direct human trafficking. However, the logic remained similar. Africa should serve European needs. The slave trade weakened many African regions at a time when Europe was growing stronger economically, militarily, and technically. It destroyed trust, intensified violence, changed political orders, and deprived many societies of manpower and stability. Later, as European powers penetrated deeper inland, they encountered regions that had already been shaken by centuries of external influence. This does not mean that Africa was defenseless. On the contrary, there was resistance everywhere. But the consequences of the slave trade had changed the initial situation. In the end, the slave trade remains one of the most brutal foundations of the modern world. He combined the wealth of Europe and America with the suffering of Africa. It turned people into commodities, destroyed communities, and shaped notions of race, power, and worth that lingered for a long time. For Africa, it was not only a demographic loss, but a historical wound, the consequences of which continued in politics, economics, and memory. The subsequent colonization of Africa cannot therefore be considered separately from this history. The continent was not only exploited in the age of imperialism. For centuries, it was already part of a violent world system that robbed its people, changed its societies, and strengthened Europe at the expense of Africa. 4. Missionaries, traders, and explorers. Before European powers subjugated Africa in the 19th century with military force, colonial administrations, and artificially drawn borders, other figures came to the fore: missionaries, traders, and explorers. They rarely came alone with the open claim to conquer a country directly. Many of them presented themselves as preachers, researchers, merchants, or travelers. But their paths, reports, maps, treaties, and trade contacts became important prerequisites for later colonial rule. They opened up spaces, collected information, made connections, and created images of Africa that had a great impact in Europe. What at first appeared to be a religious mission, scientific curiosity, or economic exchange gradually became part of a larger power process. Europe began to look at Africa no longer only from the coasts, but increasingly as a continent that was to be developed, controlled, and made economically viable. Missionaries played a particularly contradictory role in this. Many of them were genuinely convinced that they wanted to bring Christianity to Africa and lead people to a better life. They founded mission stations, schools, and infirmaries, learned local languages, translated Bible texts, and imparted European forms of education. Some missionaries actually criticized the cruelty of the slave trade and campaigned for its abolition. In some cases, they became advocates for African communities when they suffered violence, kidnapping, or arbitrary rule. But at the same time, missionaries brought with them a worldview that often regarded African religions, traditions, and social orders as inferior. They saw themselves not only as religious teachers, but often also as bearers of a supposedly superior civilization. In doing so, they helped, consciously or unconsciously, to spread the idea that Europe had the right and even the duty to change Africa. The Christian mission intervened deeply in local societies. It questioned existing belief systems, changed upbringing, family life, and authority relations. Those who attended a mission school not only learned to read and write, but often also European values, European history, and European ideas of order, work, and morality. Traditional religious authorities lost influence in some regions, while new Christian elites emerged. These changes were not the same everywhere. Some African communities took up elements of Christianity and combined them with their own ideas. Others rejected missionaries or viewed them with suspicion. Still others used mission schools strategically to gain access to scripture, administration, and new forms of political power. Mission was therefore never just a one-sided process. Africans acted, selected, contradicted, and adapted. Nevertheless, mission stations often helped to anchor a European presence in the interior of Africa. Traders were a second important group in this early phase of penetration of Africa. After the Atlantic slave trade was increasingly banned in the 19th century, European merchants looked for other goods and new ways to make a profit. Palm oil became particularly important in West Africa because it was used in the European industry for soaps, lubricants, and later other products. Ivory, rubber, peanuts, cotton, gold, and other raw materials also came more into focus. So trade did not simply shift from exploitation to equality. Rather, new economic dependencies emerged. European traders wanted to buy raw materials cheaply and sell European goods. In doing so, they increasingly intervened in local economic structures and tried to bring trade routes, rivers, markets, and production areas under control. These traders needed security, firm contracts, and political support. Where they encountered resistance or saw their profits at risk, they often called for protection from European governments. Economic interests thus became political claims. A merchant who initially only established a trading post could later become the pioneer of a colony. When a local ruler limited trade, demanded tariffs, or rejected European demands, this was often portrayed in Europe as an obstacle to freedom, progress, or civilization. In truth, it was mostly a matter of weakening African control over its own resources. Merchants were therefore not only businessmen, but actors in a growing imperial system. They provided information, exerted pressure, and combined economic goals with state power. Finally, the so-called explorers had a particularly strong influence on the European image of Africa. The term explorer is problematic, because the areas they traveled to had of course long been inhabited, known and integrated into local knowledge systems. Rivers, mountains, lakes, and trade routes did not have to be discovered by Europeans. African guides, porters, translators, and traders made many expeditions possible in the first place. Without their knowledge of routes, languages, political borders, water points, diseases, and local dangers, many European travelers would have failed. Nevertheless, European books and newspapers usually featured the names of European men as great heroes. In these representations, Africa became a mysterious, empty, or wild landscape that supposedly only became visible through European research. One of the most famous of these travelers was David Livingstone. He was a missionary, doctor, and researcher, and became an almost legendary figure in Europe. Livingstone combined Christian mission, geographical exploration, and the idea of replacing the slave trade with legitimate trade. His famous slogan of Christianity, trade, and civilization summed up a way of thinking that convinced many Europeans. They believed that Africa could be led into a better future through European religion, European trade, and European order. But this idea had a dangerous side. It portrayed Europe as a savior and Africa as an object of European design. Even if Livingstone personally wanted to fight the slave trade, His travels and reports opened up spaces for later colonial claims. His maps, descriptions, and routes made the interior of Africa more tangible for European politics and business. Other travelers and researchers also contributed to reordering Africa in European ideas. They mapped rivers such as the Congo, the Niger, or the Zambezi, described landscapes, collected plants, animals, and objects, and reported on societies that they often understood only superficially. Their reports were enthusiastically read in Europe. Newspapers, geographical societies, and scientific societies turned the expeditions into major public events. Curiosity, a thirst for adventure, racism, economic interests, and national competition were mixed. Anyone who knew a river course could plan trade routes. Anyone who suspected mineral resources could attract investors. Anyone who presented contracts with local rulers could derive political claims from them. Knowledge thus became power. This connection between discovery and rule was particularly evident in the Congo region. Henry Morton Stanley, who had become famous for his search for Livingstone, later traveled through Central Africa on behalf of King Leopold II of Belgium. Stanley concluded numerous treaties with local rulers, the importance of which many African contracting partners were hardly aware of in the European interpretation. What may have been understood as an alliance, a protective agreement, or a trade agreement from a local point of view was interpreted in Europe as a cession of rights of domination. In this way, the basis for Leopold's later claim to the Congo Free State, one of the most brutal systems of exploitation in colonial history, was created. Here it becomes particularly clear how expedition, treaty policy, and economic greed intertwined. Missionaries, traders, and explorers had an impact not only through their direct activity in Africa, but also through the image they created in Europe. Their reports often portrayed Africa as a continent of darkness, danger, wilderness, and disorder. At the same time, they told of raw materials, fertile soils, large rivers, and supposedly untapped opportunities. This mixture was politically highly effective. If Africa was considered to be in need of help and at the same time rich in resources, conquest could be disguised as a moral task. Colonialism then appeared not as robbery, but as a mission. Not as violence, but as progress. Not as foreign rule, but as order. It was precisely this narrative that became increasingly important in the late 19th century, when European states began to openly formulate their claims to power. One must not forget the African side. Missionaries, traders, and explorers did not move through a passive continent. They encountered rulers, traders, religious authorities, warriors, farmers, translators, and communities that had their own interests. Some African leaders used European contacts to strengthen their position vis-a-vis rivals. Others hoped for weapons, trade advantages, protection, or access to new technologies. Still others recognized the danger early on and tried to limit European influences. There was cooperation, mistrust, rejection, and adaptation. It is precisely this diversity that shows that the early European presence should not simply be understood as a straightforward advance. It was a process full of negotiations, misunderstandings, and growing power inequality. In the end, missionaries, traders, and explorers were decisive pioneers of colonial rule, even if they did not always pursue the same goals. The missionary wanted to save souls, the merchant wanted to make a profit, the researcher wanted to gain fame and knowledge, the politician wanted to expand power. But their paths overlapped. Mission stations became contact points. Trade bases became political levers. Expedition reports became maps of imperial planning. Treaties became pretexts for annexation. Information on rivers, markets, mineral resources, and societies was collected and used in Europe. In this way, step by step, a denser network of European influence emerged. When the European powers later began the race for Africa, they were able to fall back on this preparatory work. They knew coasts, rivers, and trade routes better than before. They had contacts with local elites. They had maps, travel reports, and economic expectations. And they had already developed a moral language with which to justify their expansion. The colonization of Africa was therefore prepared not only by soldiers and cannons, but also by Bibles, trade books, maps, travel reports, and treaties. Behind the seemingly peaceful facade of mission, trade, and research, a claim to power grew that would soon lead the continent into a new era of violence and foreign rule. 5. Europe's hunger for raw materials and markets. In the 19th century, Europe changed at a pace that was to have a lasting impact on world history. Factories grew out of the cities, railways crisscrossed landscapes, steamships shortened trade routes, banks financed large enterprises, and new industries demanded ever greater quantities of raw materials. The Industrial Revolution made Europe more powerful, richer, and militarily superior, but at the same time it made it dependent on a constant influx of materials, labor, markets, and investment opportunities. It was precisely in this context that Africa became increasingly important for the European powers. The continent no longer appeared to them as a coastal area for trade or as an area of missionary activity, but as a vast store of raw materials, land, labor, and economic opportunities. Behind the fine words of civilization, progress, and Christian mission, there was therefore often a much harder drive, the hunger for profit. Industrialization had fundamentally changed Europe's economy. In the past, many countries were still strongly influenced by agriculture, crafts, and regional trade. Now factories were established that processed cotton, built machines, produced steel, equipped ships, and produced goods in previously unknown quantities. These factories needed raw materials. Cotton, copper, palm oil, rubber, gold, diamonds, ivory, and later also ores and other mineral resources became more and more sought after. At the same time, European industries produced more goods than could be sold on domestic markets. So entrepreneurs and politicians looked for new sales areas. Africa was not seen as an equal trading partner, but as an area that should meet European needs. Raw materials were to be extracted cheaply and European goods were to be sold at a high price. That was the economic logic behind many colonial decisions. Palm oil played a special role in this. In West Africa, palm oil has long been a regional product used for nutrition, care, and the local economy. With the industrialization of Europe, its importance increased enormously. It was used for soaps, candles, lubricants, and industrial processes. Great Britain in particular showed great interest in this raw material after the slave trade was officially banned and the so-called legitimate trade was promoted more strongly. But this term was misleading. Although people were no longer deported across the Atlantic in the same way, economic dependence remained. European traders pushed to obtain palm oil in large quantities, influencing local markets and putting pressure on African producers and middlemen. What appeared to be free trade was often characterized by power inequality. This development was even more evident in the case of rubber. With the spread of new technologies, especially in the fields of industry, telegraphy, machine production, and later the bicycle and automotive industries, rubber became a sought-after material. In Central Africa, the European demand for rubber meant violence, coercion, and terror for many people. Especially in the Congo region under the rule of Leopold II of Belgium, rubber became a symbol of colonial cruelty. People were forced to deliver certain quantities. Those who did not meet the requirements had to reckon with brutal punishments. Villages were terrorized, families taken hostage, bodies mutilated, people murdered. Europe's hunger for raw materials turned entire regions into zones of fear. Rubber production shows particularly clearly that colonial economy was not simply trade, but was often based on coercion, violence, and dehumanization. Gold and diamonds also played a central role. In southern Africa, large diamond deposits were discovered in the 19th century, especially in Kimberley. Later, important gold discoveries followed on the Witwatersrand. These discoveries changed the political and economic situation of the entire region. Investors, adventurers, mining companies, and British interests pushed for control of land, labor, and transport routes. Mining required capital, machinery, infrastructure, and above all, cheap labor. African societies were increasingly forced into a system that undermined their economic independence. Taxes, land expropriation, and forced labor were supposed to make people work in mines. Most of the wealth from gold and diamonds did not flow back into African communities, but into European companies, banks, and colonial administrations. Economic interest was closely linked to political striving for power. For European states, colonies were not only sources of raw materials, but also signs of national greatness. In the age of imperialism, a large colonial empire was seen as proof of strength, prestige, and global political rank. Great Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Portugal, and Italy did not want to fall behind. Even if some colonies initially brought little economic profit, they had strategic value. Ports, estuaries, railway lines, and trade routes could be militarily and politically important. Whoever controlled an area also controlled possible resources of the future. This created a race in which economic speculation, national ambition, and geopolitical rivalry intertwined. Africa was increasingly measured, calculated, and evaluated in this way of thinking. European maps showed rivers, mountains, coasts, and presumed mineral resources. Expeditions collected information, trading companies concluded contracts, banks examined investment opportunities. The continent was no longer seen primarily as a home for people, but as an economic area. European reports often spoke of unused land, even though this land had long been used by African communities. Pastures, forests, rivers, and fields had local meanings that European planners ignored. If land was not intensively cultivated or privately owned according to European ideas, colonial powers quickly declared it available. In this way, expropriation was linguistically prepared. Another important motive was the desire for sales markets. European factories produced textiles, metal goods, tools, alcohol, weapons, and many other goods. Africa should absorb these goods. But colonial markets were rarely free. European powers created conditions in which African producers were disadvantaged. Local crafts could be displaced by cheap industrial products. At the same time, African regions have been pushed to produce certain raw materials for export instead of developing their economies according to their own needs. This change had long-term consequences. Many colonies were geared towards a few export products. This created dependencies that continued to have an effect even after the independence of many African states. The colonial powers often claimed that they were bringing infrastructure to Africa. In fact, railways, roads, and ports were built. But this infrastructure primarily served colonial interests. Railway lines often connected mines, plantations, or raw material areas with ports so that goods could be transported quickly to Europe. They were rarely planned in such a way that they strengthened African societies among themselves or enabled balanced economic development. Ports and administrative centers are also oriented towards export and control. The colonial infrastructure was therefore ambivalent. It profoundly changed Africa and could later also be used by African societies, but its original purpose was usually not development, but exploitation. In order to enforce this economic order, the colonial powers needed workers. Since many Africans did not want to voluntarily work for European companies under poor conditions, colonial administrations resorted to coercive measures. Poll taxes, hut taxes, and other levies were introduced, which had to be paid in money. Those who needed money often had to work on plantations, in mines, or in the construction of roads and railways. Thus, people were forced into a colonial money economy. In addition, there was direct forced labor, labor recruitment, and punishment for those who resisted. The freedom of African communities was massively restricted as a result. Economic pressure became a tool of political rule. The ideology of European imperialism obscured this reality. Politicians, entrepreneurs, and colonial supporters spoke of progress, order, and modernization. They claimed that Europe brings Africa trade, technology, education, and development. But the question was always who this development served. If raw materials were cheaply exported, profits were transferred to Europe and African workers were exploited, then this was not equal progress. It was an economic order in which some were to determine and others were to deliver. The colonial state did not protect the freedom of the African population, but the interests of those who wanted to control land, raw materials, and labor. Nevertheless, African societies were not simply helplessly at the mercy of this process. Many tried to defend their economic interests. Merchants negotiated prices, farmers switched to other products, communities resisted taxes, workers fled forced labor, and riots erupted in many regions. Some African elites tried to use European demand to their advantage. Others realized that economic influence could quickly create political dependence. Resistance to colonial economy was therefore not only military, but also commonplace. It manifested itself in refusal, evasion, negotiation, and adherence to its own forms of economic activity. Europe's hunger for raw materials and markets was thus one of the most important engines of the colonization of Africa. Without the Industrial Revolution, without the capital needs of European companies, without the competition of the great powers, and without the search for cheap raw materials, the race for Africa would hardly have arisen in this form. Colonialism was not only a question of flags and borders, but above all a question of economic control. It was about who owned land, who determined work, who exploited raw materials, who directed trade, and who profited in the end. For Europe, Africa meant wealth, power, and strategic advantages. For many Africans, this development meant expropriation, forced labor, violence, and the loss of economic self-determination. In the end, this chapter shows that colonization cannot be understood as a random political adventure. It was closely linked to the needs of industrial capitalism. The machines of Europe ran not only on coal and steam, but also on raw materials from colonial areas, and with the work of people who were rarely allowed to determine their own lives. Africa was forced into a global system in which European interests came first. It is precisely this economic core that makes colonialism so consequential. Because his traces did not end with the withdrawal of the colonial administrations. They persisted in trade structures, dependence on raw materials, unequal markets, and a world economy whose wealth cannot be understood in isolation from the history of colonial exploitation to this day. 6. The Berlin Congo Conference of 1884 and 1885. As the European powers became increasingly interested in Africa in the late 19th century, the danger grew that their rivalries could spiral out of control. Great Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Portugal, and other countries wanted to secure trade routes, control raw materials, expand spheres of influence, and demonstrate their national rank. Africa became more and more a scene of European power politics. But the more states made claims, the greater the concern that the race for coasts, rivers, and hinterland could lead to a war between European great powers. It was precisely for this reason that the Berlin Congo Conference of 1884 and 1885 took place. From Europe's point of view, it was intended to bring order to colonial competition. For Africa, however, it became a symbol of a tremendous historical arrogance. European powers negotiated the continent without inviting, listening to, or recognizing the people of Africa as equal political actors. The conference took place in Berlin and was hosted by Otto von Bismarck, the Chancellor of the German Empire. Germany had only emerged as a nation-state in 1871 and initially did not have a long colonial tradition like Great Britain, France, or Portugal. Bismarck himself had long been skeptical about colonies, because he wanted above all to secure Germany's position of power in Europe. But in the 1880s, the situation changed. German traders, colonial associations, and nationalist groups pushed for protected areas overseas. At the same time, Bismarck wanted to present Germany as a great power with equal rights and diplomatically control the rivalries of the other powers. The Berlin Conference offered him the opportunity to let Germany act as a mediator and at the same time to enter into colonial policy. The conference began in November 1884 and lasted until February 1885, when representatives of European states as well as the United States and the Ottoman Empire came together. African rulers, traders, scholars, or representatives of affected societies were not involved. This absence was not a coincidence, but an expression of the colonial thinking of the time. Africa was not seen as a continent of sovereign political communities, but as a space for others to decide. The fact that trade rights, river accesses, and colonial claims were discussed in Berlin without including African voices shows the asymmetry of power particularly clearly. It was not about what African societies wanted. It was about how European powers could balance their interests with each other. A central topic of the conference was the Congo region. King Leopold II of Belgium had been trying for years to secure a huge personal dominion in Central Africa. To the outside world, he presented himself as a humanitarian promoter of science, trade, and the fight against the slave trade. In reality, he pursued economic and power political goals. Through expeditions, especially with the help of Henry Morton Stanley, Leopold had treaties concluded with local rulers, which were interpreted in Europe as the basis for far-reaching claims to power. At the Berlin Conference, he succeeded in gaining international recognition for the so-called Congo Free State. This state was not a Belgian colony in the ordinary sense, but initially the private property of Leopold. The fact that a European monarch could have a vast territory in the heart of Africa practically recognized as personal property shows the extreme logic of imperialism. However, the Berlin Conference did not simply regulate the complete partition of Africa, as it is often abbreviated. It did not draw every later border directly on the map. Rather, its importance lay in establishing basic rules for colonial expansion and legitimizing European access to Africa diplomatically. The principle of effective occupation was particularly important. A European power should not only be able to assert a claim to a territory through ancient discoveries or historical rights, but must actually have a presence there, establish administration, enforce order, and enable economic activities. This principle accelerated the race for Africa enormously, because now it was no longer enough to have claims on paper. The powers had to act, establish bases, enforce treaties, send troops, and create administrations to secure their claims against other Europeans. Another key outcome of the conference was the establishment of freedom of trade in the Congo Basin and on important rivers such as the Congo and the Niger. European states wanted to ensure that no single power could completely block access to major trade routes. Rivers were crucial for trade and expansion because they ran deep into the continent and facilitated the transportation of goods, soldiers, and administrative officials. The talk of free trade sounded liberal and progressive, but it meant first and foremost freedom for European traders and companies. African control over its own markets, tariffs, or trade conditions has been increasingly weakened as a result. Freedom here did not mean equality, but open access for the economically and militarily stronger powers. The conference also discussed the fight against the slave trade and humanitarian goals. These issues were of great importance to the European public. After decades of abolitionist movements, the European powers wanted to present themselves as opponents of slavery. But this moral language was in sharp contradiction to colonial reality. While Berlin declared that it wanted to fight the slave trade and bring civilization, they were simultaneously preparing a phase of intense conquest, forced labor, and economic exploitation. Especially in the Congo, which was supposedly recognized under humanitarian auspices, a system of extreme violence later emerged. The appeal to humanity therefore often served to morally package colonial rule. Europe presented itself as the savior of Africa, when in reality it was expanding its power over Africa. For African societies, the consequences of the Berlin Conference were profound, even if many people at the time did not immediately know what had been decided in Berlin. The conference increased the pressure on the entire continent. European powers now began to occupy territories, enforce treaties, and carry out military expeditions even more determinedly. Local rulers who had previously negotiated with European traders were suddenly confronted with far-reaching claims to sovereignty. Treaties, which from an African point of view perhaps meant protection, friendship, or trade rights, were interpreted by Europeans as a cession of political rule. Where negotiations were not enough, violence followed. The conference thus created a diplomatic order for Europe, but it marked the beginning of an even more aggressive phase of conquest for Africa. Particularly problematic was the fact that European powers hardly recognized African political orders. Many regions have had kings, councils, city-states, emirates, sultanates, chieftain structures, or other forms of authority. But in colonial thinking, these forms of rule were often not considered full-fledged sovereignty. Europe determined for itself which political systems it respected and which it ignored. This allowed colonial powers to claim that they were taking possession of ownerless or insufficiently organized territories. This view not only ignored the reality on the ground, but deliberately destroyed the legal basis of African self-determination. In the files of European diplomacy, the continent became a space that could be managed, developed, and distributed. The Berlin Conference must also be understood in the context of European nationalism. Colonies became symbols of prestige. A great power without colonies was considered incomplete by many contemporaries. Newspapers, colonial associations, and politicians created a mood in Europe in which overseas territories were celebrated as a sign of national strength. For the German Empire, the acquisition of protected areas in Africa was a way to mark its place among the world powers. For France, colonial expansion was also a way to regain national self-confidence after its defeat by Germany in 1871. Britain wanted to secure its trade routes and imperial supremacy. Portugal invoked old contacts and historical claims. Belgium, or more precisely Leopold II, was looking for personal fame and fortune. Africa thus became the playing field of European ambitions, which often had their roots far removed from African realities. The consequences of this way of thinking were dramatic. After the Berlin Conference, the division of Africa accelerated at a breathtaking pace. Within a few decades, almost the entire continent came under European rule. Only a few territories were able to maintain their independence, especially Ethiopia and Liberia, although their situation also remained marked by international constraints. Most African societies were forced into colonial borders, which often took little account of existing political, linguistic, economic, or cultural contexts. Communities were separated, rival groups were forced into the same colonial state, trade areas were cut through, and new administrative centers were created. Many of these borders later survived the colonial era and still shape Africa today. The Berlin Congo Conference was therefore less a single event than a turning point in the history of imperialism. It made it clear that European powers no longer wanted to influence Africa only selectively, but wanted to systematically bring it under their control. It created rules that did not offer protection to Africans, but clarity to Europeans in the competition for booty. It gave violence a diplomatic language and exploitation a legal framework. Behind the polite talks, protocols, and treaties was the brutal fact that decisions were made over millions of people without giving them a voice. In the end, Berlin remains a strong symbol of colonial arrogance in 1884 and 1885. In a European conference hall, a continent was treated as if it were a possession, a map, an economic space, an open space for foreign interests. But Africa was not an empty space. It was home to countless societies with their own history, their own politics, and their own dignity. The Berlin Conference ignored this reality. This is precisely where its historical gravity lies. It was not the beginning of European violence in Africa, but it gave this violence a new dynamic. It transformed rivalry into a set of rules, entitlement into occupation, and economic interest into political rule. For Europe, it was a diplomatic success. For Africa, it became an omen of the coming subjugation. 7. The race for Africa. After the Berlin Congo Conference, European expansion in Africa took on a speed that surprised even many contemporaries. Within a few decades, a continent on which European powers had long been present mainly on coasts, trading places, and mission stations became a largely colonial-dominated area. This trial went down in history as the race for Africa. It was not an orderly, peaceful advance, but a mixture of diplomatic pressure, military force, economic greed, national ambition, and racist arrogance. European states acted as if they had to hurry before a rival beat them to it. Africa was not asked. African societies were ignored, threatened, fought against or forced into treaties, the consequences of which were often deliberately concealed. The race for Africa was closely linked to the logic of European imperialism. In the late 19th century, a large colonial empire was considered a sign of global political power. Britain already had a huge empire and wanted to secure trade routes, sea routes, and strategic hubs. After its defeat by Germany in 1871, France tried to gain new prestige through colonial expansion and to expand its influence in West Africa and North Africa. The German Empire, founded late and long without large colonies, also wanted to appear as a world power. Belgium, or more precisely King Leopold II, claimed a huge territory in the heart of the continent with the Congo. Portugal wanted to renew old claims, Italy sought recognition as a young great power, and Spain held smaller possessions. Every state feared being left behind in the race for raw materials, ports, and spheres of influence. This competition led to European powers wanting to turn their claims into actual rule ever more quickly. The principle of effective staffing, which had been strengthened at the Berlin Conference, put them under pressure. Anyone who claimed a territory had to show that he could control it. So protection treaties were concluded, flags were hoisted, expeditions were sent inland, military posts were set up, and administrative structures were established. Many of these so-called protection treaties were highly problematic for African rulers. They were often closed under pressure, with uneven translations or by deception. What an African ruler might have understood as a trade agreement, an alliance of friendship or military protection, was interpreted in European capitals as a submission or cession of sovereignty. Thus, on paper, colonial rule arose long before it was really enforced on the ground. But paper alone was not enough. In order to secure their claims, European powers increasingly resorted to military force. Their technical superiority played a decisive role in this. Modern rifles, artillery, steamships, telegraphs, and later machine guns gave European troops a cruel advantage in many conflicts. Small colonial armies were able to conquer large areas because they were better armed, could organize supplies, and often took advantage of local rivalries. These armies did not only consist of Europeans. African soldiers often fought under European command against other African societies. Colonial rule was thus not only imposed from outside, but also made possible by local alliances, forced recruitment, and political divisions. Great Britain pursued particularly strong strategic and economic interests in Africa. The Suez Canal, which opened in 1869, made Egypt a key point of the British Empire because it shortened the sea route to India. British control of Egypt from 1882 onwards was therefore not only a regional decision, but part of imperial world politics. Great Britain also played a central role in southern Africa. Diamond discoveries in the Kimberley and gold discoveries on the Witwatersrand made the region economically enormously attractive. British influence expanded, but came into conflict with the Boer republics and African empires. The Zulu, the Ndebele, and other societies resisted British expansion. The desire to create a chain of British spheres of influence from the Cape to Cairo became a symbol of imperial dreams, even if this vision was never fully realized. France concentrated mainly on West Africa, North Africa, and parts of Central Africa. From Senegal, French military and administrative officials advanced further and further inland. They wanted to create a coherent colonial empire that would stretch from the Atlantic to the Red Sea. In the process, they encountered powerful African opponents, such as Sémori Touré, who put up fierce resistance in West Africa for years. France relied on military expeditions, treaty pressure, and an ideology of assimilation that purported to spread French culture and civilization. In practice, however, French rule meant coercion, taxes, military control, and economic exploitation. The colonial rhetoric of freedom and civilization was at odds with the reality of submission. The German Empire entered the race comparatively late, but claimed several territories within a short time. German Southwest Africa, today's Namibia, German East Africa, Today's Tanzania with other areas, Cameroon and Togo were designated as protected areas. This word sounded harmless, but it disguised the actual violence of colonial rule. German traders, colonial associations and adventurers had concluded contracts on site, which were subsequently recognized by the Reich. Military measures to enforce German control soon followed. Especially in German Southwest Africa, the brutality of this rule was later shown in a frightening way, when the war against the Herero and Nama ended in genocide. German colonialism was shorter in time than British or French, but by no means less violent. Belgium occupied a special position because the Congo was initially not recognized as a normal Belgian colony, but as the personal possession of Leopold II. This area was huge, rich in raw materials, and difficult to control. This is precisely why Leopold's administration relied on extreme violence. The Congo became a laboratory of colonial exploitation, where rubber and ivory were extracted through terror, hostage-taking, and forced labor. The race for Africa showed its naked form here. Behind humanitarian promises was a system that evaluated people only according to how much raw material they could supply. International criticism later led to the Congo being taken over by the Belgian state, but the violence and exploitation had already left deep wounds. Portugal versucht unterdessen, zijn alten Kusten besitzingen in Angola und Mozambique zu größeren Zusammenhängenden Kolonien auszubauen. Portugiesische Politiker träumten zeitweise von einer Verbindung zwischen Angola im Westen und Mozambique im Osten. Doch dieser Anspruch geriet mit britischen Interessen in Konflikt. Großbritannien setzt Portugal unter Druck, und Portugal muss seine Pläne zurücknehmen. Dieser Konflikt zeigt, dass die afrikanischen Gebiete nicht nur nach lokalen Möglichkeiten, sondern vor allem nach europäischen Machtverhältnissen bewertet wurden. Was in London, Paris, Berlin oder Lissabon entschieden wurde, hat direkt Folgen für Menschen, die von diesen Hauptstädten weit entfernt lebten. Italy, on the other hand, was looking for colonial glory in East Africa. It brought Eritrea and later Somalia under control, but suffered a heavy defeat against Ethiopia in the Battle of Adwa in 1896. This victory of Ethiopia was of enormous symbolic significance. An African state had defeated a European colonial power on the battlefield and defended its independence. Adwa showed that the European advance was not unstoppable. Ethiopia had procured modern weapons, acted diplomatically skillfully, and achieved a broad military mobilization under Emperor Menelik II. The victory was perceived worldwide by people fighting against racism and imperialism. He remained an exception, but a powerful exception. The race for Africa meant a time of extreme uncertainty for African societies. Old trading areas were cut up, political alliances lost their importance, new borders were created, and local rulers had to decide whether to fight, negotiate, or evade. Some tried to play off one European power against another. Others signed contracts in the hope of securing their autonomy. Still others took up arms. There was no uniform African approach to colonialism because the situations were very different. But African societies everywhere faced a similar problem. They had to respond to a power that wanted not only trade, but domination. The speed of conquest should not obscure the fact that European control was often superficial at first. Huge areas could be marked in colors on maps, but on the ground, colonial powers first had to laboriously enforce their rule. Many regions remained resistant or difficult to access for years. Colonial administrations were often thinly staffed and dependent on local mediators. Nevertheless, the cartographic division had an enormous effect. It created claims that were later filled with violence. A line on a European map could mean that a village suddenly belonged to a French, British, or German colony, even though the people there had never agreed. By the end of the race, Africa had almost completely come under European control. By 1900, only Ethiopia and Liberia were formally independent, while the rest of the continent was divided into colonies, protectorates, and zones of influence. This development was not the result of natural superiority or historical necessity. It was the result of violence, economic power, technical superiority, diplomatic ruthlessness, and colonial ideology. Europe had not discovered Africa, had not saved it, and had not ordered it. It had taken possession of the continent because it had the power to do so, and because it believed it had the right to do so. The race for Africa was therefore one of the decisive moments in modern history. In just a few decades, the political map of an entire continent has been changed. Borders were drawn, empires destroyed, systems of rule reshaped, and millions of people forced into colonial orders. The consequences reached far beyond the time of the conquest. The new borders, economic dependencies, and colonial administrative structures continued to shape many African states long after independence. The race for Africa was not just a chapter of European foreign policy. It was a violent intervention in the history of Africa, the shadow of which remains visible to this day. 8. Violence, resistance, and submission. The colonization of Africa was not a peaceful administrative act and not a mere change of borders on European maps. It was a process of violence. The terms protected area, protectorate, freedom of trade, or civilizing mission concealed military conquests, punitive expeditions, forced contracts, hostage-taking, expropriations, and the systematic breach of African self-determination. European colonial powers liked to portray their expansion as regulatory policy. They claimed they would bring peace, fight the slave trade, facilitate trade, and supposedly lead backward societies into the modern age. But for many Africans, colonial rule first manifested itself in the form of soldiers, cannons, taxes, forced work, and the loss of land. The subjugation of Africa was therefore associated with resistance from the beginning. This resistance was diverse, courageous, and often desperate, but it was long belittled in European accounts or dismissed as a mere rebellion against progress. African societies did not react uniformly to the European advance. Some rulers initially tried to negotiate because they hoped to preserve their power through treaties or to exploit European rivalries for themselves. Others sought alliances with a colonial power against local opponents. Still others recognized early on that European treaties were not equal agreements, but often precursors to submission. Wherever colonial powers claimed land, demanded taxes, controlled trade routes, or disempowered traditional authorities, resistance arose. Sometimes it was openly military, sometimes political, sometimes religious, sometimes everyday and invisible. People fled, refused work, sabotaged colonial infrastructure, hid crops, attacked guards, or clung to their own forms of rule. Colonial rule, therefore, had to be enforced again and again. An early and well-known example of military resistance was the Zulu struggle in southern Africa against British expansion. The Zulu kingdom was a major military power in the region in the 19th century. It had a strong warrior organization, clear political structures, and a pronounced awareness of its own sovereignty. When the British wanted to expand their influence in South Africa, the Zulu Empire came under increasing pressure. In 1879, it came to war. In the Battle of Isandlwana, the British suffered a heavy defeat against the Zulu, who won despite technological disadvantages through discipline, agility, and tactical strength. This victory shook the British self-image. He showed that African armies were by no means helpless. But the British mobilized more troops and modern weapons. A few months later, Zulu power was broken militarily. The war shows the tragedy of many resistance movements. Individual victories were possible, but Europe's long-term material superiority made lasting defense extremely difficult. In West Africa, too, powerful rulers and states put up fierce resistance. In particular, Samori Touré, the founder of the Wassoulou Empire, became one of the most important anti-colonial figures of the late 19th century. He recognized the danger of French expansion early on and tried to counter it with military organization, diplomacy, and strategic retreat. Samori built up a modern army, procured firearms, organized administration, and tried to keep his rule flexible. For years, he succeeded in delaying the French advance. He evaded, moved centers of power, and used the vastness of space. But France had greater resources, better supply opportunities, and the political will to finally break the resistance. In 1898, Samori was captured. His struggle shows that African resistance consisted not only of spontaneous uprisings, but also of strategically thought-out statesmanship. In Asante, in today's Ghana, the British also encountered a state with a strong political tradition. The Asante Empire had built up a significant position of power in the 18th and 19th centuries and controlled important trade routes. The British tried to expand their influence on the Gold Coast, but Asante repeatedly defended its independence. Particularly symbolic was the resistance for the Golden Sea, which for Asante was not simply a symbol of power, but a sacred expression of the unity of the people. When British representatives claimed this chair, thus violating Asante's political and spiritual dignity, there was renewed resistance. British power eventually prevailed, but Asante's resistance showed how closely political sovereignty, cultural identity, and religious significance were intertwined. Colonial subjugation was therefore not only a military defeat, but an attack on the soul of a community. In what is now Zimbabwe, the Shona and Ndebele resisted British expansion. The British South Africa Company under Cecil Rhodes tried to bring large areas under economic and political control. The focus was on land, mining rights, and manpower. As colonial rule increasingly intervened in people's lives, uprisings broke out in the 1890s. These battles were not only military, but also spiritual. Religious authorities played an important role because they conveyed hope, legitimacy, and cohesion. For the colonial power, such movements were particularly dangerous because they showed that resistance did not come from kings or warriors alone, but could be deeply rooted in society. The suppression was carried out with great severity and led to the further consolidation of colonial control. Colonial violence was particularly cruel in German Southwest Africa, today's Namibia. There, the Herero and later the Nama came into an existential conflict with German colonial rule. German settlers claimed land and livestock, debt relations were exploited, and traditional livelihoods were destroyed. When the Herero rose up against German rule in 1904, the German Empire reacted with brutal military force. Under General Lothar von Trotha, a war of annihilation was waged. After the Battle of the Waterberg, the Herero were driven into the Omahik Desert, where many died of thirst. The Nama also resisted and were persecuted, deported, and forced into camps. Tens of thousands of people died. This war is now considered a genocide against the Herero and Nama. He shows with shocking clarity how colonial rule could turn into annihilation when a colonial power not only wanted to defeat the resistance of a population, but also to destroy its livelihood. In German East Africa, too, there was a major uprising against colonial rule. The Maji Maji War from 1905 to 1907 was a reaction to forced labor, taxes, cotton cultivation, and the humiliations by the German administration. Various groups joined forces, supported by the hope of spiritual protection through the so-called Maji, a sacred water to which a protective power was ascribed. For many of those involved, this resistance was more than a military struggle. It was an attempt to shake off an unbearable order and to regain one's own dignity. The German reaction was devastating. In addition to military force, the colonial troops relied on scorched earth. Villages, fields, and supplies were destroyed. The result was hunger, disease, and mass death. The uprising was crushed, but it remained an important symbol of anti-colonial memory in East Africa. In Ethiopia, on the other hand, something was achieved that was rare in colonial Africa: the successful military defense of independence. In the late 19th century, Italy wanted to expand its colonial empire in East Africa and subjugate Ethiopia. But Emperor Menelik II had recognized the danger. He modernized his army, procured weapons, used diplomatic contacts, and united various forces of the empire. In 1896, the Battle of Adwa took place. The Ethiopian army defeated the Italians devastatingly. This victory was of enormous importance. He refuted the idea of European invincibility and was celebrated worldwide by people who suffered from racism and colonial oppression. Ethiopia remained independent and became a symbol of African self-assertion. At the same time, Ottawa shows that successful resistance required not only courage, but also political unity, military preparation, modern weapons, and favorable international conditions. The European colonial powers often explained African resistance as insurrection, unrest, or barbarism. In doing so, they wanted to prevent this resistance from being understood as a legitimate struggle for freedom. Anyone who defended himself against foreign rule was called a disturber of order. Those who defended land were seen as an obstacle to progress. Anyone who refused to pay taxes was punished. This language was part of colonial power. It made violence invisible or presented it as a necessary measure. Punitive expeditions were described as a restoration of calm, although they often burned down villages, killed people, and intimidated entire regions. The colonial power claimed the right to use violence while criminalizing the resistance of the subjugated. But resistance did not end in military defeats. Even after formal submission, he lived on. People preserved memories of defeated rulers, told stories of battles, practiced forbidden rituals, or sought new ways of political organization. Later, educated elites emerged in mission schools who used the language of the colonial power to argue against colonial injustice. Workers organized strikes. Farmers resisted forced cultivation. Soldiers from the colonies who served in European wars returned with new experiences. The open military resistance of the 19th and early 20th centuries thus became a basis for later nationalist movements. The subjugation of Africa was therefore never complete in the inner sense. Colonial powers could establish administrations, collect taxes, draw borders, and station armies. But they could not simply erase memory, pride, and the desire for self-determination. The violence of conquest created fear, but also anger. It destroyed political orders, but it brought about new forms of cohesion. It forced people into colonial systems, but at the same time it generated the experience of common oppression from which anti-colonial movements later drew strength. In the end, the history of violence, resistance, and subjugation shows that Africa was not passively colonized. The continent was conquered, but it did not surrender easily. Everywhere there were people who fought, negotiated, fled, sabotaged, remembered, and survived. Some resistance was crushed militarily, some ended in disasters, some preserved only small spaces of autonomy. But they all refute the colonial image of a continent without a will. The colonization of Africa was a struggle for land, power, work, and dignity. Europe often won this battle with weapons, money, and technical superiority. But the moral significance of the resistance remained. It shows that freedom was defended even where the chances were slim. And it reminds us that colonial rule did not only come about through European decisions, but had to be enforced against the will of countless people. 9. Colonial systems of rule. After the European powers had occupied large parts of Africa militarily or claimed them by treaties, a new phase of colonization began. Now it was no longer just a matter of coloring areas on maps or getting ahead of rival European states. Now rule had to be enforced in everyday life. The colonial powers had to collect taxes, mobilize workers, secure borders, export raw materials, suppress resistance, and control the population. To this end, they developed different systems of rule, which differed depending on the colonial power, region, and economic interest. But despite all their differences, they had a common core. African societies were robbed of their political self-determination and forced into orders that served European interests. Colonial rule was never just administration. It was power over land, work, body movement, language, education, and law. European officials decided which authorities were recognized, what taxes had to be paid, what work had to be done, and what forms of resistance were punished. The number of European colonial officials was often surprisingly small. Large areas were controlled by a few administrators who relied on soldiers, police, local helpers, interpreters, and African intermediate authorities. Colonial power was therefore based not only on a direct European presence, but on a system of violence, dependence, cooperation, and intimidation. An important model was indirect rule, especially known from the British colonial empire. The British administration often tried to integrate existing local authorities into the colonial system. Kings, chiefs, emirs or councils of elders were not always eliminated immediately, but were used as mediators. They were supposed to collect taxes, provide labor, pass on orders, and ensure peace in their territories. At first glance, this model seemed less destructive than direct rule because it seemed to respect traditional structures. But in reality, these structures have often been profoundly changed. Local rulers became tools of colonial administration. Their authority was no longer based solely on recognition by their community, but on the support of a foreign power. This was particularly evident in northern Nigeria, where the British used existing Emirati rule structures after the conquest of the Sokoto Caliphate at the beginning of the 20th century. The emirs formally remained in their positions, but had to submit to British requirements. They became part of a colonial system that demanded taxes, controlled the judiciary, and ultimately subordinated political decisions to British interests. This sometimes made it difficult for the population to see where traditional authority ended and colonial rule began. This was precisely the strength of this system. The colonial power was able to exert its influence without having to be visible everywhere. But indirect rule was by no means gentle. If local authorities refused to carry out colonial orders, they could be deposed, replaced, or militarily punished. Colonial powers often even created new chiefs where there had been no centralized rule before. In societies that were traditionally more communal or decentralized, colonial administrations imposed a hierarchical structure. This created new power relations that could exacerbate conflicts within societies. People who used to have influence through advice, voting, or social recognition were displaced by people who were useful to the colonial power. In this way, indirect rule changed not only politics, but also social relations. France relied more heavily on direct rule and on the idea of assimilation, even if this idea was only realized to a limited extent in practice. French colonial ideology claimed that subjugated people could become French citizens through French language, education, and culture. This promise sounded universal, but it was deeply contradictory. Only a very small African elite was actually given limited rights. The vast majority remained subjects without full political participation. In many French colonies, the so-called indigenate, a special legal system that treated Africans differently from European citizens, was in force. Colonial officials could impose punishments, order forced labor, and restrict freedom of movement without those affected having the same rights as Frenchmen. The direct rule of France often meant greater centralization. French civil servants tried to shape administration, law, school, and economy according to French ideas. African languages were often devalued, while French was considered the language of power and education. Those who wanted to move up had to adapt to colonial expectations. But here, too, the reality remained marked by inequality. The French Republic spoke of freedom, equality, and fraternity, but in its colonies coercion, racism, and political deprivation of rights prevailed. The colonized were to accept French order, but not be treated as equal people. Belgian rule, especially in the Congo, was strongly oriented towards economic exploitation and strict control. The Congo Free State under Leopold II was initially an extreme example of private colonial rule. Administration, military, and companies worked closely together to extract rubber and ivory. The population was forced to work by force. Later, after the takeover by the Belgian state, some excesses were restricted, but the basic principle remained the same for a long time. The Congo should supply raw materials and generate profits. Education was only promoted to a limited extent, and political participation was hardly permitted. The Belgian colonial administration deliberately kept the population dependent and prevented the emergence of a broadly educated elite for a long time. This policy had serious consequences for the later transition to independence. The German colonial system was comparatively short-lived, but also characterized by military thinking, racist hierarchy, and economic pressure. In German Southwest Africa, German East Africa, Cameroon, and Togo, administration, settler interests, plantation farming and violence were combined. Especially in areas with European settlers, land grabbing played a central role. African communities lost grazing land, farmland and watering holes. In German Southwest Africa, Herero and Nama were increasingly disenfranchised by treaties, debts, settler pressure and military force. The colonial administration did not see itself as the protection of the African population, but as a guarantor of European order and economic use. A central tool of almost all colonial rulers was taxes. Poll taxes, hut taxes, or other levies forced people to raise money. Since many African societies had not previously been equally oriented towards the money economy, they now had to work for colonial companies, plantations, mines, or infrastructure projects. Taxes were therefore not only a source of income, but a means of mobilizing labor. Those who could not pay were punished or forced to work. Tax policy intervened deeply in people's lives because it changed traditional ways of doing business and often forced men to leave their families and villages for wage labor. Forced labor was another central element of colonial rule. It was justified in different ways. Sometimes it was said that the population had to build roads, railways, or public buildings. Sometimes work was demanded for plantations or raw material extraction. Colonial powers presented this as a contribution to development. In fact, it often meant hard work in poor conditions, little or no pay, violence, and high mortality. Roads and railways usually did not serve the needs of the local population, but the transport of raw materials, troops, and administrative officials. The colonial infrastructure was thus a visible expression of colonial priorities. The legal system also became an instrument of control. Europeans and Africans were often treated differently. Europeans were subject to different courts, different penalties, and other protective rights. African legal concepts were sometimes used, changed, or ignored, depending on what benefited the colonial power. Colonial courts served not only to resolve conflicts, but also to enforce labor discipline, tax liability, and political obedience. Resistance was criminalized. Anyone who resisted land grabbing, taxes, or forced labor was not considered a defender of their own rights, but a rebel. Education was also part of colonial rule. Mission schools and state schools taught reading, writing, religion, and European values, but usually only to a limited extent. The colonial powers needed scribes, interpreters, low-level civil servants, and assistants, but did not want to create a broad education that could strengthen political demands. Education was therefore ambivalent. On the one hand, it opened up new opportunities for some Africans. On the other hand, it was intended to stabilize the colonial order. But it was precisely this limited education that later gave rise to a generation that recognized colonial contradictions and argued against foreign rule. Colonial systems of rule also worked through language and ideology. The colonized were constantly portrayed as backward to justify their subordination. European administration, European law, and European education were considered superior. African institutions were either romanticized when they were useful or despised when they resisted. This ideology shaped not only politics, but also the self-image of many people. Colonialism not only wanted to force obedience, but also to gain the sovereignty of interpretation. He wanted to determine what counted as progress, order, law, and civilization. Despite these means of power, colonial rule was never completely stable. It had to be constantly negotiated, defended, and renewed. Local authorities sometimes used their position to pursue their own interests. Civil servants often had an inadequate understanding of the societies they governed. People evaded taxes, fled forced labor, defied orders, or used colonial courts for their own purposes. The colonial order was powerful, but it was not omniscient. Everywhere there were intermediate spaces in which Africans acted, survived, and tried to preserve room for maneuver. In the end, the colonial systems of rule show that colonization was far more than military conquest. It was the permanent transformation of societies according to foreign interests. Whether direct or indirect rule, whether British protectorate, French administration, Belgian exploitation economy, or German protectorate. The aim was always to limit African self-determination and secure European control. The methods differed, but the result was similar. Land, labor, law, education, and political power were forced into a colonial system. This system shaped the lives of millions of people and left behind structures that continued to have an effect even after the end of colonial rule. 10. The Congo Free State and the Cruelty of Exploitation. The Congo Free State is one of the most harrowing examples of colonial violence in Africa. It shows how economic greed, racist arrogance, diplomatic deception, and brutal rule could combine to form a system that brought suffering to millions of people. What began outwardly as a humanitarian project, as an alleged fight against the slave trade, and as an attempt to bring trade and civilization to Central Africa, in reality became a huge area of exploitation. The Congo was initially not an ordinary colony of a European state, but the personal property of King Leopold II of Belgium. A single monarch had an area recognized that was many times larger than Belgium itself. Behind the facade of progress and charity, one of the cruelest systems of rule in colonial history emerged. Leopold II was not a powerful ruler of a large world empire like Great Britain or France. Belgium was a small European state, but Leopold dreamed of imperial fame, wealth, and international prestige. Since Belgium itself initially showed little enthusiasm for colonial adventures, Leopold pursued his plans largely personally. He presented himself in Europe as a promoter of science, geographical exploration, and humanitarian mission. He founded associations with melodious names, which were supposed to serve the exploration of Africa and the fight against the slave trade. But this language was camouflage. Leopold wanted access to land, raw materials, and labor. He understood early on that Central Africa offered enormous economic opportunities, especially if you gained control of the Congo and its tributaries. Henry Morton Stanley played a central role. The famous traveler, who had previously become known for his search for David Livingstone, later worked for Leopold. Stanley traveled through the Congo region, founded stations, explored rivers, and concluded numerous treaties with local rulers. These contracts were often highly problematic. Many African signatories probably did not understand it in the European sense as a cession of comprehensive sovereignty. In African political traditions, such agreements could mean protection, trade, friendship, or limited rights of use. In Europe, however, they were read as the basis for property claims. Thus, in the eyes of European diplomats, local agreements were transformed into documents of colonial rule. The Congo was not created by an open referendum or equal negotiation, but by a combination of deception, pressure, translation gaps, and imperial interpretation. At the Berlin Congo Conference of 1884 and 1885, Leopold's project received international recognition. The so-called Congo Free State was accepted as an independent entity, officially under the banner of free trade and humanitarian responsibility. The name Free State was cynical, because it was mainly European companies, traders, and Leopold's administration that were free there. The people of the Congo were not treated as citizens of a free state, but as workers, subjects, and means of profit. Leopold promised the world to fight the slave trade, promote mission and trade, and develop Central Africa. In fact, he built a rule that was not based on consent, but on violence and coercion. Initially, ivory played an important role. European markets demanded ivory for piano keys, jewelry, objets d'art, handles, and luxury goods. But rubber soon became even more important. With the technical development in Europe and North America, the demand for rubber rose sharply, with bicycles, electrical cables, machines, and later automobiles making rubber a sought-after raw material. In the Congo Basin, there was wild rubber extracted from lianas. For Leopold and his representatives, this became a huge source of income. But the extraction was laborious, dangerous, and labor-intensive. Instead of paying fair wages or organizing voluntary trade, the administration forced the population to collect ever larger quantities of rubber. The system was based on quotas, violence, and fear. Villages had to supply fixed quantities of rubber. If they did not meet the requirements, penalties were threatened. The force publique, a colonial military force under European officers and with African soldiers, became the instrument of this rule. It collected taxes, took hostages, burned down villages, beat people, killed resistors, and terrorized entire regions. Women and children were often detained to force men to work on rubber. Those who fled risked retaliation against their family or village. The violence was not accidental, but part of the system. It was intended to get people to supply raw materials, even if it meant neglecting fields, destroying families, and tearing communities apart. The mutilations became particularly notorious. Soldiers of the force publique had to prove in some cases that they had not wasted their ammunition. Severed hands became gruesome evidence of allegedly killed opponents. In practice, people were also mutilated alive, and the practice became a symbol of Congo terror. To this day, the severed hand stands for the dehumanization of this system. It shows how far colonial violence could go if people were seen only as a means of extracting raw materials. The body of the colonized became a place of punishment, deterrence, and demonstration of power. Rubber exploitation destroyed the social and economic life of many regions. Men were forced to search for rubber in the forest for days or weeks. Fields remained uncultivated, harvests failed, hunger spread. Diseases, refugee movements, and violence have dramatically reduced the population. Families were torn apart. Traditional authorities were pressured or replaced if they did not cooperate. Entire villages tried to evade the grasp, but flight often meant loss of land, food, and safety. There was always resistance, but it was usually brutally suppressed. The people of Congo were in a situation in which every attempt at survival created new risks. For a long time, the European public learned little about the true extent of the violence. Leopold sent controlled information. He continued to present himself as a benefactor and supporter of the mission. Some missionaries and travelers reported atrocities, but their voices had to be heard against Leopold's propaganda. Over time, however, international criticism grew. The British consul Roger Casement, who investigated the conditions in the Congo and presented a report documenting the violence, played a decisive role. The journalist and activist Edmond Dean Morel also became a central figure in the Congo reform movement. He recognized from trade data that large quantities of rubber and ivory were coming to Europe from the Congo, while hardly any normal trade goods were declining. From this he concluded that the supposedly free trade was in fact based on coercion. The Congo reform movement became one of the first major international human rights campaigns of the modern era. Newspapers, public lectures, photographs, mission reports, and political speeches made the violence in the Congo visible. Photographs of mutilated people in particular shocked many viewers. They broke through the abstract language of trade and administration and showed the physical reality of colonial rule. Well-known personalities such as Mark Twain also sharply criticized Leopold. Nevertheless, it took years for political pressure to have concrete consequences. Leopold tried to deny his responsibility, feign reforms, and secure economic profits. In 1908, the Congo Free State was finally taken over by the Belgian state and transformed into the Belgian Congo. This ended Leopold's personal rule, but not the colonial subordination. Although some of the most extreme practices of the Congo Free State were restricted, the basic structure remained. The Congo remained an area whose raw materials, labor, and political order were subordinated to European interests. Mining, plantation farming, mission schools, and administration shaped further colonial history. The population did not receive real political self-determination. The Belgian rule relied on control, paternalistic paternalism, and economic exploitation. The transition from Leopold's private state to a Belgian colony was therefore not an end to colonialism, but a change in its form. The cruelty of the Congo Free State is particularly important historically because it makes many basic features of colonial rule visible in an extreme form. First, it shows the power of language. Words such as the Free State, civilization, trade and humanity could be used to disguise violence. Second, it shows the connection between capitalism and coercion. The European demand for rubber has been directly translated into labor quotas, hostage-taking, and corporal punishment. Third, it shows how international diplomacy could legitimize colonial exploitation. The recognition of Leopold by European powers made his reign possible. Fourth, it shows how difficult it was to stop colonial violence, even when it became known, as long as economic interests remained strong. For the people of Congo, this time meant a deep historical wound. The violence destroyed trust, demographic structures, local economies, and political orders. She left behind memories of fear, loss, and humiliation. The Congo was not only exploited, it was massively damaged in its social development. The country's later history, its difficult independence, its political crises, and the enduring importance of its raw materials cannot simply be reduced to the colonial era, but they cannot be understood without this past. From the outside, the Congo was seen as a treasure trove, not as the home of people with their own rights and their own future. The Congo Free State therefore stands as a warning to this day. It shows what can happen when power comes together without control, economic greed without moral boundaries, and racist ideology without recognition of human equality. Leopold II ruled not only through his soldiers, but also through the willingness of other powers to look the other way or to profit. The violence in the Congo was not a slip, but a logical consequence of a system that devalued people and put raw materials above life. This is precisely why this chapter is so central to the history of the colonization of Africa. It shows colonial reality in its most brutal form and forces us to ask how much suffering lies hidden behind the wealth that Europe drew from its colonies. 11. German colonial policy in Africa. German colonial policy in Africa began comparatively late, but within a few years it developed into a violent system of economic interests, military control, racist ideology, and political prestige. While Great Britain, France, and Portugal had already gained colonial experience for a long time, the German Empire did not come into being until 1871. In the first years after the founding of the Reich, Chancellor Otto von Bismarck concentrated primarily on securing Germany's position of power in Europe. Colonies initially seemed risky, expensive, and diplomatically dangerous to him. But in the 1880s, the mood changed. Traders, colonial associations, nationalist publicists, and parts of the bourgeoisie now demanded that Germany must also become a world power. An empire that saw itself as a new great power no longer wanted to stand by and watch other states divide Africa among themselves. This colonial turn had several causes. German merchants were already active on African coasts, especially in West Africa and southwestern Africa. They sought protection for their trade interests and urged the imperial government to recognize their treaties with local rulers. At the same time, a nationalist mindset grew in Germany that saw colonies as a sign of greatness and strength. Newspapers and colonial propagandists spoke of new markets, raw materials, emigration areas, and national honor. Many dreamed of a place in the sun, even if this expression only became particularly popular later. Behind this was the idea that Germany, like Great Britain or France, had to develop beyond Europe. Colonies were thus understood less as sober economic projects and more as a symbol of the fact that the young empire wanted to belong to the first rank of world powers. The first German protected areas in Africa were established in 1884. The term protected area sounded harmless, almost caring, but it concealed the actual balance of power. In truth, it was not about protecting African societies, but about securing German trade and claims to power. In Southwest Africa, today's Namibia, the Bremen merchant Adolf Luderitz concluded treaties on land rights, the significance of which was hardly understood by the African contracting parties in the European sense. The German Reich placed these areas under its protection and turned them into German Southwest Africa. During the same period, Togo, Cameroon, and German East Africa also became German colonial territories. In a short time, a German colonial empire emerged on African soil, stretching from the Atlantic coast of West Africa to the Indian Ocean. German Southwest Africa occupied a special position because it was intended as a settlement colony more than other German colonies. German settlers wanted land, livestock, and economic opportunities. But the land was not empty. Herero, Nama, Damara, and other communities lived there, using pastures, water points, and trade routes. The German land grab directly interfered with their livelihoods. Contracts, debts, fraud, violence, and colonial courts led to more and more land falling into the hands of German settlers and societies. Especially for the Herero, whose economy was heavily based on livestock breeding, the loss of land and herds was existential. The colonial order placed European ideas of property above African rights of use and quickly declared resistance to this expropriation a rebellion. In German Southwest Africa, the brutality of German colonialism was shown in its most extreme form. In 1904, the Herero rose up against German rule. Their uprising was directed against land grabbing, economic dependence, violence by settlers, and the humiliations of the colonial order. The German reaction was devastating. Under General Lothar von Trotha, the war was not only waged as a military suppression, but as an attempt to destroy the Herero as a political and social community. After the Battle of the Waterberg, many Herero were driven into the Omahique Desert, where they died of thirst or were shot if they tried to return. Von Trotha's notorious extermination order still stands for the murderous logic of this war. The Nama, who also resisted, were also persecuted, deported, and forced into camps. Tens of thousands of people died from violence, hunger, thirst, disease, and camp conditions. The war against the Herero and Nama is now considered genocide. This genocide was not an accidental outbreak of individual brutality, but stood in a larger context of colonial ways of thinking. African life was rated lower. Resistance was not understood as a legitimate defense of land and freedom, but as a rebellion against a supposedly higher order. German military and settlers often spoke in racist categories, in which Africans appeared to be an obstacle to German development. It was precisely this dehumanization that made extreme violence possible. Those who do not regard the population of a country as equal people, but as a disruptive factor, can more easily justify expropriation, forced labor, and extermination. German Southwest Africa thus became a place where colonial violence, racism, and settler interests collided in a particularly devastating way. German East Africa, which roughly comprised present-day Tanzania as well as parts of Rwanda and Burundi, was also marked by violence. German rule began there with trade claims and treaties of the German East African Society. But it soon became apparent that economic control could hardly be enforced without military force. Coastal uprisings and resistance in the interior were crushed. The colonial administration introduced taxes, demanded work, and forced many people into new economic structures. Cotton cultivation in particular became a symbol of colonial intervention. African farmers were supposed to produce for export, even though this put a strain on their diets, work rhythms, and local economies. The colonial administration expected obedience, taxes, and labor, but offered hardly any rights or protection. The largest uprising against German rule in East Africa was the Maji-Maji War from 1905 to 1907. It arose from a deep dissatisfaction with forced labor, taxes, cotton cultivation, and colonial arbitrariness. Various groups joined forces, supported by the hope of spiritual protection and joint action. The name Maji referred to a sacred water that was said to have a protective power. For those involved, the uprising was not only a military struggle, but also an attempt to shake off an unbearable foreign rule. The German reaction was brutal. The Schutztruppe relied on military superiority and a scorched earth strategy. Fields, villages, and supplies were destroyed to starve the resistance. The consequences were catastrophic. In addition to the fallen, many people died of hunger and disease. The uprising was crushed, but it remained a powerful symbol of anti-colonial resistance. In Cameroon and Togo, German colonial rule took a different course, but here too it was a matter of economic use, administrative control, and the enforcement of German authority. Togo was often portrayed by German colonial officials as a model colony because it caused comparatively low administrative costs and appeared to be economically viable. But even there, the order was based on coercion, taxes, plantation management, and political subordination. In Cameroon, the situation was even more complex because the colony was geographically, ethnically, and economically very diverse. German expeditions advanced inland, treaties were concluded, resistance was broken militarily. Plantations, trade, and infrastructure projects mainly served German interests. Railways and roads were not built primarily to strengthen the African population, but to be able to move goods, soldiers, and administration more quickly. A central feature of German colonial policy was the close connection between the economy and coercion. Colonies should be self-financing as much as possible and enable profits. This required workers. Since many Africans did not want to work voluntarily under colonial conditions, taxes, forced labor, and punitive administration were used. Those who had to pay taxes needed money and were thus forced into wage labor. Those who refused had to expect penalties. This policy deeply interfered with existing ways of life. People were pushed out of their local economies, families were separated, communities lost control over their work and their land. The colonial state was thus not a neutral administrator, but an active organizer of exploitation. Mission and education also played an important role in the German colonies. Missionaries founded schools, churches, and infirmaries. Some stood up against individual excesses or documented violence. At the same time, many missions were part of a cultural transformation process. African religions and traditions were devalued. European morality and Christian order were portrayed as superior. Education remained limited and was primarily intended to produce useful assistance. A broad political education that would have made real equality possible was not planned. The colonized were to serve, work, and obey, not participate in decisions as equal citizens. German colonial rule formally ended with the First World War. German colonies were conquered by Allied troops and transferred to other powers after the war as mandate territories of the League of Nations. But the short existence of the German colonial empire should not lead to the assumption that its importance was small. In just a few decades, Germany left deep traces of violence, exploitation, and memory. In particular, the genocide of the Herero and Nama, but also the Maji-Maji War and the everyday tyranny in the colonies show that German colonialism was not a marginal chapter. It was part of European imperialism and followed the same basic patterns of domination, racism, and economic appropriation. For a long time, German colonial history played only a minor role in the public consciousness. National Socialism and the Second World War overshadowed many other stories of violence. But for the affected societies in Africa, the memory remained alive. Loss of land, mass violence, looted cultural assets, human remains in European collections, and colonial humiliations continued to have an effect. Today, there is more talk about Germany's responsibility for this past. Debates about recognition, apology, restitution, and reparation show that colonial history is not over. It concerns not only archives and history textbooks, but also political relations, the culture of remembrance, and questions of historical justice. Germany's colonial policy in Africa shows how quickly a state that entered the race late could resort to brutal rule. Trade interests became protected areas became violent orders, economic expectations became forced labor and land grabbing. The German colonial power spoke of order, development, and protection, but for many people it meant expropriation, subjugation, and death. This chapter reminds us that colonialism was not just a history of other European empires. Germany was also involved. Germany also benefited. Germany also exercised violence. Anyone who wants to understand the colonization of Africa must therefore clearly name Germany's role, not as an exception, but as part of a larger system of European power over Africa. 12. Everyday life under colonial rule. Colonial rule was not only a question of large treaties, military conquests, and political decisions in European capitals. For the people in Africa, it was particularly evident in everyday life. It determined who could own land, what taxes had to be paid, what work was required, what language was used in school, which religion appeared to be progressive, which paths could be used, and which authorities were recognized. Colonialism was therefore not only an external power relationship between Europe and Africa, but an order that penetrated deeply into daily life. It changed villages, cities, families, work rhythms, gender roles, education, beliefs, and the way people planned their future. Especially in everyday life, it became apparent that colonial rule was not abstract. It intervened in body, time, space, and dignity. For many Africans, the experience of colonial rule began with taxes. Colonial administrations introduced poll taxes, metallurgical taxes, or other levies that had to be paid in money. This was a crucial intervention because many local economies were not primarily based on money, but on agriculture, livestock, barter, community work, and regional markets. Those who needed money now often had to look for work in colonial companies. Men went to plantations, mines, railway projects, or cities to earn wages. This has torn families apart and changed traditional ways of working. Women, children, and the elderly had to take on more tasks in agriculture in some regions because men were absent for weeks or months. The tax was thus more than a source of income. It was a tool to force people into the colonial world of work. Work under colonial rule was often hard, poorly paid, and accompanied by violence. People had to grow cotton, coffee, cocoa, rubber, sisal, or peanuts on plantations. They worked in mines under dangerous conditions, especially in South Africa, the Congo, and other resource-rich regions. In the construction of railways, roads, and ports, workers were often recruited under duress. Colonial administrations liked to present such projects as a sign of progress. But for many of those affected, they meant illness, hunger, beatings, long separation from the family, and sometimes death. The infrastructure that was created usually did not primarily serve the local population, but the transport of raw materials and the rapid movement of soldiers and officials. A railway line often connected a mine or plantation region with a port, not necessarily African communities. The country itself also became a contested space in everyday life. In settlement colonies such as German Southwest Africa, Kenya, and South Africa, European settlers appropriated large areas of land, while African communities lost grazing areas, water points, and fertile farmland. Sometimes they were pushed into reserves where the soil was worse and there was not enough space. The loss of land did not only mean economic impoverishment. Land was often associated with ancestors, identity, political order, and spiritual significance. When colonial authorities registered, sold, or lent land to European farmers, they also destroyed existing relationships between people, history, and landscape. For many communities, this was a deep humiliation. The colonial city became a new space of experience. Cities grew because administrations, ports, mines, and trading centers attracted workers. In these cities, new social groups emerged: workers, domestic workers, small merchants, soldiers, clerks, teachers, policemen, and Christian-educated elites. But colonial cities were rarely places of real equality. They were often structured according to racist ideas. European neighborhoods had better roads, bigger houses, utilities, and police protection. African neighborhoods were often more densely populated, poorly equipped, and more controlled. Residence permits, passport systems, and proof of employment restricted freedom of movement. The city promised opportunities, but at the same time it showed the hierarchy of colonial power every day. Schools were another area in which everyday life and rule were combined. Many schools were founded by missionaries. They brought reading, writing, arithmetic, and Christian teaching, but also European ideas of discipline, family, morals, and work. For some African families, education was an opportunity. Those who could read and write could work as interpreters, teachers, clerks, or low-level administrative employees. Education opened up paths that were previously closed. But colonial education remained limited. It was usually not intended to produce self-confident political citizens, but useful subordinates. African history has often been devalued or ignored. European languages were considered the language of advancement, while African languages appeared to be backward. In this way, school became both a place of hope and a tool of cultural subordination. Mission and religion also changed everyday life. Churches, mission stations, and Christian festivals became part of life in many regions. Some people accepted Christianity out of conviction, others associated it with their own religious ideas, and still others used contact with missions to gain access to education, protection, or new networks. But missionaries often also intervened in family structures, rituals, and local authorities. Polygamy, ancestor cults, initiation rites, or traditional healing practices were often condemned as pagan or uncivilized. This created conflicts between generations, between converts and non-converts, between missionary norms and local traditions. Religious change was therefore not simply a peaceful adoption of new beliefs, but part of a broader struggle for power, identity, and dignity. Gender roles were also changed by colonial rule. In many regions, colonial administrations directed their policies primarily at men because they preferred male chiefs, workers, soldiers, and taxpayers as interlocutors. This weakened some existing female authorities. At the same time, women often bore the burden of colonial changes particularly strongly. When men migrated to wage labor, women had to carry agriculture, child-rearing, utilities, and local markets more on their own. In other cases, women themselves became workers on plantations or in urban households. Missionary ideas of marriage, household, and female virtue also changed social expectations. But women were not only victims of these trials. They traded, organized markets, preserved traditions, protested against taxes, and later played important roles in anti-colonial movements. Colonial rule also worked through violence and constant intimidation. Police, soldiers, and local auxiliaries stood for the power of the colonial state. Anyone who did not pay taxes, refused to work, or disobeyed orders could be punished. Corporal punishment, imprisonment, forced labor, and fines were part of everyday life in many colonies. This violence did not have to affect everyone on a daily basis in order to be effective. It was often enough for everyone to know what could happen. The colonial order lived from visible power. Uniforms, flags, official buildings, courts, and prisons reminded people that a foreign rule decided their lives. Nevertheless, everyday life was not only characterized by submission. Africans found ways to deal with, use, circumvent, or undermine the colonial order. Farmers secretly grew other crops. Workers changed employers. Families sent individual children to mission schools. Traders took advantage of new markets. People translated colonial rules into their own interests. Some local authorities cooperated with the administration externally, but protected their community internally. Others used colonial courts to resettle old conflicts. Everyday life was a space of adaptation, but also of quiet resistance. Not every resistance consisted of weapons. Sometimes it consisted of taking time, carrying out instructions slowly, withholding information, or continuing cultural practices in secret. Over time, a new African public sphere emerged under colonial rule. Newspapers, schools, churches, associations, trade unions, and urban meeting places became places where people talked about injustice. Educated Africans read European ideas of freedom, justice, and self-determination and asked why these values should not apply to them. Workers recognized their common situation. War veterans came back with new experiences. Christian preachers combined religious messages with criticism of oppression. Thus, a political consciousness slowly grew out of everyday colonial life, which was later to strengthen the struggle for independence. Everyday life under colonial rule was therefore full of contradictions. Colonies brought roads, schools, cities, and new trade opportunities, but these changes came about in a system of inequality. They offered opportunities to individuals while depriving others of land, freedom, and security. They linked Africa more closely to the world economy, but on terms that favored European interests. They changed societies without giving them the freedom to decide for themselves on the direction and pace of these changes. In the end, a look at everyday life shows how deep colonialism had an effect. It was not just a political system, but a daily experience of control, adaptation, coercion, and survival. He sat in the tax claim, in the employment contract, in the textbook, in the police station, in the missionary prayer, in the lost field, and on the way to the mine. But the will to preserve dignity also lived on in everyday life. People loved, worked, raised children, told stories, celebrated rituals, sought opportunities, and resisted in open or silent ways. This is precisely why everyday life under colonial rule is so important. It shows not only what colonialism destroyed, but also how people continued to act, hope, and preserve their own history under difficult conditions. 13. The First World War and Africa's colonies. When the First World War broke out in Europe in the summer of 1914, this conflict initially seemed far removed from the villages, cities, plantations, and trade routes of Africa. The causes lay in European alliance systems, imperial rivalries, nationalism, military planning, and the crisis after the assassination in Sarajevo. But the colonial world order ensured that a European war almost immediately became a global war. Africa was not a periphery of this conflict, but was drawn into it because large parts of the continent were under European rule. The colonies did not belong to themselves. They were the property, zone of influence, source of raw materials, recruiting area, and strategic position of the European powers. That is why the War of the European States was also waged on African soil and supported by African people, although most of them had neither decided on its causes nor profited from its goals. The First World War changed Africa on several levels. He made it clear how much the continent was already involved in Europe's power politics. British, French, German, Belgian, and Portuguese colonies became theaters of war or supply rooms. Colonial armies were mobilized, porters were forcibly recruited, food and animals were confiscated, ports and railways were used for military purposes. For the colonial powers, it was not only a matter of defeating their opponents in Europe, but also of conquering their possessions in Africa. German colonies immediately became targets of Allied attacks because Germany had only a few but strategically important colonies compared to Great Britain and France. The war thus also became a continuation of imperial competition by military means. This was particularly evident in Togo. The German colony was small, but of strategic importance because of its radio station in Kamina. This station could relay messages between Germany and overseas and was therefore an important target for the Allies. British and French troops attacked Togo shortly after the war began. The German forces were numerically weak and could only offer limited resistance. After just a few weeks, Togo was occupied. For the local population, this did not mean a transition to freedom, but only the change from one European colonial power to another. People were not asked whether they wanted German, British, or French rule. Their land was part of an imperial game in which possessions were shifted like strategic figures. Cameroon also became a theater of war. The German colony was larger, geographically more difficult to control, and militarily more resilient than Togo. British, French, and Belgian troops attacked from different sides. The war in Cameroon dragged on for a long time because German troops and African soldiers under German command used the area and retreated into the interior. But here, too, the German position could not be maintained in the long run. The Allies had greater resources, access to the sea, and the ability to exert pressure from neighboring colonies. In 1916, the German resistance largely ended. Part of the German troops withdrew to neutral Spanish Guinea. For Cameroon, a new phase of colonial division then began, in which France and Great Britain divided the territory among themselves. In German Southwest Africa, today's Namibia, the war was particularly closely linked to the history of Southern Africa. The South African Union, which belonged to the British Empire, attacked the German colony. Not only British interests played a role, but also South African expansion goals. The German Schutztruppe was isolated and could hardly expect reinforcements from Europe. In 1915, it capitulated. This development was bitter for the African population. Only a few years earlier, the Herero and Nama had experienced war, annihilation, camps and expropriation under German rule. Now the area did not become independent, but came under South African control. This, too, did not mean liberation from colonial order. On the contrary, the later South African administration continued many forms of racist rule and combined them with its own interests. However, the longest and best-known African theater of war was German East Africa. There, the German commander Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck waged a guerrilla war against British, Belgian, and Portuguese troops that lasted for years. His strategy was to tie up as many Allied forces as possible in Africa, and thus keep them away from other theaters of war. Militarily, this campaign was later often admired because Lettow-Vorbeck managed to hold out for a long time despite poor supplies and numerical inferiority. But this admiration often obscures the price paid by African people in particular. The war in East Africa was a catastrophe for the local population. Armies moved through villages and fields, food was confiscated, people were forced to carry them, diseases spread, and entire regions suffered from hunger. Porters were indispensable for the war in Africa. Because of poor roads, difficult landscapes, limited railway lines, and long distances, weapons, ammunition, food, and equipment often had to be carried by people. Hundreds of thousands of Africans were used as porters by various colonial powers, often under duress or massive pressure. The work was extremely hard. Many died of exhaustion, disease, malnutrition, or abuse. These people hardly appear in many traditional depictions of the First World War, although without their work the military operations in Africa would hardly have been possible. The war was not only waged by soldiers, but carried on the backs of countless porters, whose suffering remained invisible for a long time. African soldiers also played a central role. The colonial powers had units consisting of African recruits and led by European officers. In French service, for example, tirailleurs sénégalais, although this term referred not only to soldiers from today's Senegal, but from various parts of French West Africa. Great Britain deployed African troops in several colonies, as did Germany its askari in East Africa. Many of these men were brought into the ministry by promise, pressure, or coercion. Some were looking for pay, social advancement, or protection. Others had little choice. They fought in a war whose political goals were not their own, and yet they became important players on the battlefields of Africa and, to some extent, outside the continent. The deployment of African soldiers posed a problem for colonial ideology. European rule was based on the assertion of white supremacy and African subordination. But during the war, colonial powers were dependent on African soldiers. They had to use their courage, discipline, and fighting power while continuing to deny them political equality. This experience was not without consequences. Many veterans returned after the war with a changed consciousness. They had seen that Europeans were vulnerable, that white soldiers were afraid, died, and could be defeated. They had fought for empires that often offered them little recognition, poor care, and no real rights. This disappointment later fueled political criticism and anti-colonial movements. The war also weighed heavily on colonial economies. In many areas, crops were confiscated, livestock was confiscated, and workers were withdrawn. The supply situation deteriorated. Trade routes collapsed, prices rose, and the war economy increased the pressure on the population. In some regions, natural disasters, droughts, or diseases were added. The Spanish flu, which raged worldwide in 1918 and 1919, also hit Africa hard and exacerbated the consequences of the war. Many people therefore experienced the First World War not as a heroic struggle, but as a time of hunger, coercion, disease, and insecurity. The European powers spoke of honor and fatherland, but in the colonies, war often meant that foreign states had even greater access to people and resources. After the end of the war in 1918, Africa was again reordered without any real African say. Germany lost all its colonies. The Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations mandate system transferred these territories to victorious powers. Togo and Cameroon were divided between France and Great Britain. German East Africa became largely British Mandate territory and administered as Tanganyika, while Rwanda and Burundi came under Belgian Mandate administration. German Southwest Africa was transferred to South Africa as a Mandate territory. Officially, it was said that these areas were administered in the interests of their people and prepared for a better future. In fact, colonial foreign rule remained. The mandate system replaced direct annexation with a new legal language, but did little to change the lack of self-determination of the people. The new order after the First World War showed the contradictions of international politics particularly clearly. American President Woodrow Wilson spoke of the right of peoples to self-determination, but this principle was applied above all to Europe. African peoples were not given any real opportunity to decide on their political future. The colonial powers claimed that they were trustees and had a civilizing responsibility. But in practice, they wanted to continue to secure raw materials, labor, and strategic advantages. Many Africans recognized this double standard. If Europeans spoke of freedom and national self-determination, why didn't that apply to Africa? In the decades that followed, this question became increasingly politically explosive. At the same time, the First World War weakened the myth of European moral superiority. Europe had presented itself as civilized, orderly, and superior. But the war showed a different reality: industrial mass killing, poison gas, trenches, hunger blockades, and the destruction of entire societies. For many people in the colonies, it became apparent that the alleged bearers of civilization were themselves capable of tremendous violence. This realization did not immediately mean the end of colonial rule, but it damaged its ideological foundation. The colonial powers could continue to use violence, but their claim to moral superiority became more fragile. In Africa itself, new political experiences arose after the war. Veterans, workers, teachers, clergy, and urban elites began to criticize colonial injustices more strongly. In some regions, protest movements, religious renewal movements, and early forms of nationalist organization grew. Most independence movements were still weak and regionally limited, but the seeds had been planted. The war had shown that the colonies were indispensable for the European empires. Without African soldiers, porters, raw materials, and food, the powers would have found it harder to sustain their global war effort. This gave rise to a new question. If Africans had to fight and suffer for the empires, why should they continue to be left without rights? The First World War was therefore a turning point for Africa, even if it did not end colonial rule. He changed property relations, shifted borders, destroyed the German colonies, and initially strengthened other empires. At the same time, however, it produced experiences that had a long-term effect against colonialism. African soldiers and porters had experienced the fragility of European power. Colonial societies had seen how ruthlessly empires seized people and resources in times of crisis. The language of freedom, justice, and self-determination became better known, even if it was initially denied to the colonized. In the end, the First World War shows that Africa was not on the edge of world history. The continent was deeply involved in global power relations. The colonies became theaters of war, supply rooms, and booty for the victors. African people fought, carried, suffered, and died in a war they had not started. After 1918, the flags over some areas changed, but foreign rule remained. It was precisely this bitter experience that made it clear to many that colonial promises were worth little as long as political power was in European hands. The war shook Europe, but it also shook the foundations of colonialism. It still took decades before the great wave of independence. But one of the cracks in the colonial building already appeared in the years of the First World War. 14. Nationalism and the struggle for independence. After World War I, Africa remained largely under colonial rule, but something had changed beneath the surface. The European powers continued to have a strong effect on the outside world. They controlled administrations, armies, police, schools, ports, railways, and raw materials. They determined borders, taxes, working conditions, and political rights. But the experience of the war had left cracks in colonial thinking. African soldiers and porters had fought, suffered, and risked their lives for European empires without being recognized as equal citizens afterwards. Many had seen that Europeans were not invincible. They had experienced that the alleged bearers of civilization were themselves capable of enormous destruction. At the same time, terms such as self-determination, nation, freedom, and rights became more and more widespread. What the colonial powers claimed for themselves continued to be denied to the people of Africa. It was precisely from this contradiction that modern anti-colonial nationalism grew slowly but inexorably. African nationalism did not arise in a single place and not from a single cause. It was the result of many experiences. Farmers resisted forced cultivation, land grabbing, and taxes. Workers protested against poor wages, dangerous working conditions, and racist treatment. War veterans demanded recognition and care. Teachers, clergy, journalists, and students began to publicly criticize colonial injustice. Associations, newspapers, trade unions, religious movements, and political groups emerged in cities. Some initially demanded not immediate independence, but better rights, fairer treatment, access to education, and participation in the administration. But the clearer it became that the colonial powers did not want to grant basic equality, the stronger the demand for self-government grew. The newly educated elites played a special role. Colonial schools were not originally intended to produce revolutionaries. They were to create scribes, interpreters, teachers, low-ranking officials, and obedient co-workers. But education could not be completely controlled. Those who could read and write could understand colonial laws, publish newspapers, give speeches, and absorb international ideas. Many African intellectuals read European texts on freedom, human rights, and national self-determination, and asked a simple but dangerous question: why should these rights apply only to Europeans? Some studied in Europe or America, where they encountered anti-colonial ideas, socialist movements, black civil rights organizations, and Pan-African thinkers. They returned with a new political consciousness and began to see colonial rule no longer as an immutable fate. Pan-Africanism became an important intellectual force. It arose from the experience that people of African descent were connected worldwide by slavery, colonialism, and racism. Thinkers and activists such as W.E.B. Du Bois, Marcus Garvey, and later many African politicians emphasized the dignity of black people and the need for political self-determination. Pan-African congresses brought together voices from Africa, the Caribbean, Europe, and America. Although these movements were often small and supported by educated minorities at first, their symbolic significance was great. They gave the fight against colonialism an international language. Africa was no longer seen as a collection of individual colonies, but as a continent with a common experience of oppression and a common claim to freedom. The Second World War accelerated this development even more. Once again, African soldiers and workers were mobilized for European war goals. Again, the colonial powers demanded loyalty, sacrifice, and obedience. At the same time, Britain and France fought against Nazi Germany with a promise to defend freedom and democracy. For many colonized people, this sounded contradictory. How could an empire fight tyranny and at the same time deny political rights to millions of people in Africa? After 1945, the European colonial powers were weakened. Some of their economies were on the ground, their moral authority was damaged, and new balance of power emerged worldwide. The United Nations spoke more strongly of human rights and self-determination. The USA and the Soviet Union were critical of classical European colonialism for different reasons. In this new world order, it became more difficult for European powers to take colonial rule for granted in the long term. In West Africa, strong independence movements emerged particularly early on. On the Gold Coast, later Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah became a central figure. It combined mass mobilization, Pan-African ideas, and the demand for immediate self-government. His party, the Convention People's Party, organized strikes, demonstrations, and political campaigns. Nkrumah understood that independence could not only be requested in conference rooms, but had to be fought for through public pressure. In 1957, Ghana became the first country south of the Sahara to become independent. This moment had an enormous effect. He showed that colonial rule could end. Ghana became a symbol for the entire continent, and Nkrumah became a voice of African liberation. National movements also grew in other British colonies. In Nigeria, a vast and diverse country, political parties developed along regional, ethnic, and social lines. The path to independence was complicated there because the colonial border united very different societies in one state. Nevertheless, Nigeria became independent in 1960. In Kenya, the struggle was harder and more violent. There, European settlers had claimed large parts of fertile land, especially in the highlands. The Mau Mau movement, mainly supported by Kikuyu, was directed against land loss, colonial oppression, and racist rule. The British reaction was brutal. There was a state of emergency, mass arrests, camps, torture, and executions. Kenya became independent in 1963, but the price of the struggle was high and the wounds remained deep. In the French colonies, the path was different, but no less contradictory. After 1945, France tried to maintain its colonial empire through reforms and new community models. It offered limited political participation, but wanted to maintain control as much as possible. African politicians such as Léopold Sédar Senghor in Senegal, Félix Houphouët-Boigny in Ivory Coast, and Sékou Touré in Guinea moved between negotiation, reform, and demand for independence. In 1958, under Sékou Touré, Guinea decided not to remain in the French community and chose immediate independence. France reacted harshly and abruptly withdrew many administrative and economic resources. But the signal was clear: African states could leave the colonial framework. 1960 then became the so-called African Year, in which numerous French colonies became independent. The Algerian War of Independence was particularly dramatic. Algeria was not an ordinary colony for France, but was considered part of French territory. A large European settler population lived there, while the Muslim majority was politically and socially disadvantaged. The Front de Libération Nationale began the armed struggle against France in 1954. The war was fought with great severity. Assassinations, torture, massacres, resettlements, and counterviolence characterized the conflict. Algeria did not become independent until 1962. This war shook not only Algeria, but also France itself. It showed how far a colonial power could go to hold possessions, and how resolutely a colonized population could fight when political avenues were blocked. The path to independence was not the same everywhere. Some countries achieved them through negotiations, others through armed struggle. In Portuguese colonies such as Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau, Portugal held on to its colonial empire for a particularly long time. Protracted wars of liberation arose there, which only led to the end of colonial rule after the Carnation Revolution in Portugal in 1974. In South Africa, Namibia, and Zimbabwe, the struggle for independence was combined with a struggle against white minority rule and racist settler systems. Namibia did not become independent until 1990. In South Africa, apartheid did not end until the 1990s. This shows that decolonization was not a single moment, but a long, unequal, and often bloody process. The anti-colonial struggle was never just a fight against Europe. It was also a struggle over the question of what the future should look like. Should the new state be socialist, capitalist, Pan-African, federal, centralist, democratic, or revolutionary? What role should traditional authorities play? How could one accept borders that had been drawn by colonial powers? How should different languages, religions, and ethnic groups be combined in one state? Many independence movements had to create broad alliances, even though their supporters had very different interests. Farmers wanted land, workers wanted better wages, elites wanted political power, young people wanted education, women wanted more social participation, veterans wanted recognition. Unity against the colonial power often concealed conflicts that became visible again after independence. Despite all the difficulties, the struggle for independence was a huge historical turning point. He destroyed the idea that Europe had a natural right to rule Africa. It gave millions of people back the feeling of being able to decide on their own future. Flags were hoisted, national anthems were sung, new constitutions were written, capitals were celebrated. But the joy was often associated with uncertainty. The new states inherited borders, administrations, and economic structures that had not been created for self-determination, but for control and exploitation. Many were dependent on the export of a few raw materials. Education systems were limited, administrations thin, political institutions young. Independence was therefore a beginning, not a conclusion. In the end, African nationalism shows that colonial rule could never permanently extinguish the longing for freedom. The colonial powers had armies, police, courts, and prisons. But they could not prevent people from recognizing the contradictions of the system. They could not prevent school children from becoming politicians, workers from becoming trade unionists, veterans from becoming critics, church interiors from meeting places, and colonial cities from becoming centers of protest. The struggle for independence was one of courage, hope, disappointment, strategy, and sacrifice. He was not perfect, not uniform, and not free of inner conflicts. But he changed the world. Africa stepped out of formal colonial subordination and reclaimed its place in history. 15. The legacy of colonization. The end of colonial rule meant a historic awakening for Africa, but it did not mean that the consequences of colonization suddenly disappeared. When more and more African states became independent in the second half of the 20th century, they were faced with a daunting task. They had to build new nations, take over administrations, stabilize economies, expand education systems, create political unity, and at the same time live with borders that had mostly arisen not from African developments, but from European power decisions. The flags changed. The national anthems were rewritten, presidential palaces were occupied by African governments, but many structures of the colonial era remained. This is precisely where the depth of the colonial legacy lies. Colonialism was not just a foreign government that could be deposed. He had reshaped societies, economic areas, ways of thinking, borders, and power relations. One of the most visible legacies of the colonial era is the borders. Many African states emerged within colonial drawn lines. These borders separated communities that had belonged together for a long time and at the same time forced groups into common states that had previously formed different political, economic, or cultural spaces. Of course, it would be too easy to attribute all subsequent conflicts to colonial borders alone. African societies had experienced rivalries, power struggles, and wars even before the colonial era. But the colonial demarcation of borders exacerbated many problems because it created political entities that had rarely grown out of internal historical development. New states had to create national identities where colonial rule had previously often deliberately emphasized differences, played off groups against each other, or favored certain elites. Thus, the task of nation-building became particularly difficult after independence. The colonial administrative systems also continued to have an effect. Many new states took over administrative structures, courts, police apparatuses, and central governments that had originally been created not for democratic participation, but for control. The colonial state was mostly authoritarian, hierarchical, and oriented towards command and obedience. He had rarely promoted local self-determination, but had collected taxes, organized work, monitored resistance, and secured raw materials. After independence, African governments were faced with the challenge of transforming these apparatuses into tools of their own state. This succeeded to varying degrees. In some countries, democratic experiments emerged; in others, one-party rule, military regimes, or authoritarian systems prevailed. Many factors played a role in this, but the colonial legacy of a strong, often repressive administrative state was an important background. The economic consequences were particularly deep. The colonial economy had geared many African regions towards the export of a few raw materials. Cocoa, coffee, cotton, peanuts, copper, gold, diamonds, rubber or oil were produced for the world market, while industrial processing usually took place outside Africa. Ports, railways and roads had often been built in such a way that raw materials could be brought from the interior to the coast. They connected mines, plantations and export centers, but not necessarily the people and regions of a country. After independence, many countries therefore inherited economies that were heavily dependent on price fluctuations on the world market. When the price of an export product fell, entire national budgets came under pressure. This dependence made independent development more difficult and made many countries still vulnerable to external interests. In addition, colonial rule had often hindered local industries and independent economic development. African labor and resources mainly served European companies and markets. Education was expanded only to a limited extent, technical education often remained weak, and broad economic participation was not the goal of colonial policy. After independence, many states lacked skilled workers, capital, infrastructure, and stable institutions. This was not a sign of a lack of ability, but a consequence of a ruling system that had not prepared Africa for independence. For decades, the colonial powers had claimed that they would bring development, but they had almost always defined development according to their own interests. The colonial legacy was also evident in social structures. In many regions, colonial administrations had favored certain groups because they were seen as reliable mediators, soldiers, civil servants, or local authorities. Other groups were disadvantaged, displaced, or regarded as resistant. Such imbalances could increase political tensions after independence. Land issues also remain highly problematic. In settlement colonies such as Kenya, Zimbabwe, Namibia, or South Africa, European settlers had claimed particularly fertile areas. The return or redistribution of this land became one of the most difficult questions of post-colonial politics. Land was not only possession, but also the basis of life, memory, dignity, and power. Another legacy was the cultural and psychological dimension of colonialism. For generations, colonial schools, churches, administrations, and sciences had conveyed that European languages, European history, European religion, and European forms of knowledge were higher than African traditions. African cultures were often portrayed as backward, irrational, or inferior. This devaluation left its mark. After independence, many societies not only had to gain political freedom, but also regain cultural self-confidence. Writers, historians, artists, and intellectuals began to retell African history, criticize colonial interpretations, and make repressed perspectives visible. The recovery of one's own history became part of the liberation. Language played a special role in this. Many African states retained the languages of the former colonial powers as official languages, such as English, French, or Portuguese. There were practical reasons for this, because these languages facilitated administration, education, and international communication, and could serve as a neutral connecting language in linguistically diverse countries. At the same time, a colonial legacy remained visible in it. Those who wanted to have access to education and power often had to master a European language. African languages continued to be spoken in everyday life, but did not always receive the same status in schools, science, administration, and politics. Language thus became a sign of advancement, but also of inequality. Colonialism also continued to have an impact internationally. Many former colonies remained closely linked to their former colonial powers economically, militarily, or diplomatically. France retained strong influence in many former colonies, Great Britain via the Commonwealth, Portugal and Belgium in other ways. Companies from Europe and later from other regions of the world continued to control important raw material chains. Loans, development aid, trade agreements, and military cooperation created new dependencies. These conditions are often described as neo-colonialism. The term does not mean that the old colonial rule simply continued unchanged, but that power and dependence could continue to have an effect even without a direct foreign government. A country could be formally independent and still be strongly influenced economically by external forces. At the same time, it would be wrong to tell Africa's history after the colonial era only as a story of victimhood and heteronomy. African states, movements, and societies acted actively. They founded the Organization of African Unity, later the African Union, supported liberation movements, developed their own political ideas, built universities, created literature, music, film, science, and new forms of Pan-African cooperation. Many countries made progress in education, health, infrastructure, and political participation, even if these advances were often accompanied by crises, wars, corruption, or external intervention. The colonial legacy explains many difficulties, but it does not deprive African societies of their own agency. History is never just what was done to people, but also what they make of it. The memory of colonization is still contested today. In Europe, colonialism has long been trivialized or treated as a side issue. There is talk of explorers, missionaries, and infrastructure, but much less often of forced labor, land grabbing, racist violence, looted cultural assets, and destroyed societies. In recent years, debates about apologies, reparations, return of works of art, and human remains have become stronger. Museums, universities, and governments must ask themselves how much of their property and knowledge comes from colonial power relations. For many people in Africa and in the African diaspora, this is not just about the past, but about recognition. Those who do not name suffering continue the humiliation. Those who do not recognize robbery as robbery make justice impossible. The legacy of colonization is thus evident in borders, economy, language, education, memory, international relations, and political institutions. It is not an easy legacy that can be explained in one sentence. Not every problem in Africa today is automatically a direct consequence of colonialism. Even after independence, African governments made their own decisions, both good and bad. There have been abuses of power, corruption, civil wars, and undesirable political developments, for which Europe alone cannot be held responsible. But it would be just as wrong to underestimate colonial influence. Colonialism created starting conditions that placed a heavy burden on many states. It drained resources, distorted economies, destroyed political orders, and left deep wounds in societies. In the end, the colonization of Africa remains a story of power and resistance, of violence and survival, of destruction and new beginnings. Europe did not come to Africa as a neutral teacher, but as a conqueror, trader, missionary, soldier, administrator, and entrepreneur. It spoke of progress, while often organizing exploitation. It drew boundaries while cutting up contexts. It built schools and roads while denying political rights. But Africa did not remain silent. The continent resisted, adapted, preserved memories, fought for independence, and continues to write its history. The question of the colonial legacy is therefore also a question for the present. Who still benefits from old structures today? Who is responsible for stolen goods, destroyed communities, and unequal economic relations? What can memory look like that not only wards off guilt, but also allows truth? And how can a future emerge in which Africa is not viewed through colonial images, but as a continent of its own voices, its own possibilities, and its own dignity? The colonial era is over, but its shadows have not disappeared. Recognizing them does not mean stopping in the past. It means understanding the present more honestly and thinking about the future more justly.